Welcome to this compilation of 4 sci-fi short stories about societies of the future. I'll be narrating Ecology on Rollins Island by Varley, The Velvet Glove by Harry Harrison, The Snowball Effect by Katherine MacLean, and Marley's Chain by Alan E. Nourse. If you'd like to hear more of my narrations, make sure to check out my Substack page where I post 3 free stories a week and a bonus novelette or serialized novel for paid subscribers. That's over at storiesfromthesky.sff.substack.com, link in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Ecology on Rollins Island by Varley. Narrated by William Sky. Man's every resource was being stripped to feed the millions on Earth, but George was a throwback and a poacher, and his punishment had to fit the crime. There's a library in a small town near Charles Neck on Murdoch Sound. It's so run down and useless that a lot of old books still hang around on the shelves, the big kind with stiff backs and all kinds of fancy little stars or small curly designs to show the end of one section and the beginning of another. Very quaint. After the WFI took over the sound in our remote area, I didn't have much to do in the daytime, so I used to walk down the road to town and get a handful of these stiffbacks once in a while. From reading them, I got the notion I'm a one-man resistance movement, which is pitiful and foolish, and I gather always has been a seedy, run-down sort of thing, a backward state of mind and feelings. That's me all right, backward. I tried to be forward, but it made me hard to live with, and since I live mostly with myself, I had to quit. Still, I knew I couldn't get away with backwardness, and that sooner or later the WFI would slap me down, squash this bussing insect, and get on with its work again as usual. Sure enough, one bleak November morning, when I was halfway through a couple of eggs and a cup of coffee, I heard the throb of a motor. I walked down to the end of my wharf and looked skyward. I was pretty sure they wouldn't come by land because most of the secondary roads were in bad shape, and they wouldn't travel by water because that took too much gas and time. In fact, the WFI never wasted anything. They couldn't afford to. Everything went for food, its growth, collection, and processing. The big freighters, some of them, had atomic piles, but that power was impossibly clumsy and expensive for smaller boats. So they came by air in the usual inspection helicopter. The pilot dropped her in the cove right alongside the wharf and made fast. 3 men stepped onto the planks. They had the wheat sheaf insignia of the WFI on their overcoat arms and caps, and they looked cold and bored. A small sea sucked at the pilings and the helicopter rose and fell, grating against the wharf. I looked at the pilot and said, "Better put your chafing gear out if you intend staying a while." We all watched while the pilot put a few capots at the tight spots. Then he looked at a notebook and said, "You George Arthur Henry?" I said, "Call me George." This inspector was the usual type, tired from long hours, bored from doing nothing on a weary round of food inspections. He hunched his shoulders against the wind. I said, "It's warmer inside." They followed me into the kitchen of the house. All 3 of them started to sit down, then stopped and walked over to the table in perfect step. They looked at the cold remains of my breakfast eggs. The WFI inspector shoved his hat up and said, "Eggs?" The others nodded, wordless with wonder. Then the inspector said, "Chickens?" "Where," I said, "do you think I got the eggs?" The little man alongside the inspector came to life. In 3 dexterous movements he had glasses on, a notebook in his hand, and stylus poised. "What do you feed them?" he inquired eagerly. "Seeds," I said. "Insects, chopped up garter snakes, mussels, ground up oyster shells. You boys have all the grain." There was an excited light in the little man's eyes. He hurried out to a broken-down shed to examine the chickens. That left 2 of them. The inspector continued to gaze at the remains on the plate in a dreamy way. The other man straightened his big shoulders, looked at me and said, jerking his thumb toward the shed, "Mr. Carter's an ecologist. He just came along for the trip. He's on his way to the government experimental farm over at Murdoch. I'm a government sociologist. I was sent here to have a talk with you. My name is Ranson." "Sure, sit down. I guess I'm licked, but there's no use making a rumpus about it." I turned to the inspector whose eyes were still caught in the egg plate. I said, "Ever taste them?" "Once," he said in a faraway voice. I went to the cupboard and came back with a paper bag full of eggs and put it in his hands. He held them as if someone had just given him the wheat sheaf badge of merit. "I won't be needing these after our little talk, I expect. Take them home to the kiddies." He smiled, looked at the sociologist who grinned back and nodded. The inspector walked very carefully out of the back door and down to the wharf to stow his eggs in the helicopter. Ranson shifted in his chair. He said, "That was very nice of you, Mr. Henry." "George," I said. "Against the law, of course." There was a smile around his eyes. "Are you against the law, George?" "Yes, no use bluffing. You know the story. All the waters and everything in them are WFI. All the land and everything on it. I don't like packaged food, I like real food. I don't like my oysters, crabs, clams, fish, minced up and blended with chickweed, cereals, yeast, algae, plankton, and flavoured to taste a little like steak. And plenty of others feel the same. I have a market." "An illegal market?" "Yes," I said. "By God, if you had told my father before I was born that the oysters he tonged could not be eaten as oysters, he'd have laughed in your face. And if you had told him he wouldn't even be allowed to tong them, he'd have cussed you good and proper. People have to be fed. The only way we can do it is to combine the total food resources of the world, process and package them, and do it as efficiently as possible. That means absolute control of all food sources and their harvesting. You could work for WFI, George. It would be important work." "I know. It's so important nothing else gets done. Have you seen the roads around here? Half the bridges are down across Charles Neck and Walter Hook. You can't get gas, you can't get telephones, and if you happen to have one, it doesn't work half the time. And the buses don't run anymore, and—" Ranson held up his hand. "It's an emergency, George. You have to realise that. It's been building up for a long time, long before your father worked the oyster beds in Murdoch Sound." "There's another thing," I said. "Before you fellows closed the Sound, I was independent. I had my own boat and I made my own way. Now you put your WFI scoops in the Sound and the whole job is done in a month or two. And who are the watermen? A couple of clerks to every scoop who turn a valve every once in a while and draw their packaged food, clothing and entertainment once a week. Do you call that a job? Why, those food clerks couldn't even lift a pair of 30-foot rakes, let alone tong with them. We get more oysters, George, and in less time, and we do it scientifically." Ranson tapped his notebook with the stylus and he looked out of the kitchen window. He was giving me time to cool off. He'd been kind and patient when he didn't have to be either. With his job, he had no time to sit and reason with a one-man resistance movement. He had no time for anything but food and organising society to keep it grubbing incessantly for food, and at the same time to keep society as orderly and contented as possible. I was not orderly and I was not contented. But I was just one man, not society. I cooled off. I said, "Look, Ranson, it's like this. I know you're right. I've had a look around and I've thought about it some. The figures are with you. Too many men and not enough food. Only thing is, even from your point of view, I'm not fit for WFI. I have to be on my own. There ought to be somewhere, some place for a man instead of a food clerk." I trailed off unhappily. "I'm afraid you have no alternative, George. You are a criminal in the eyes of the WFI. Either you will work for WFI or you will be punished." He paused. "I won't work for them." Carter, the ecologist, burst in at the door, slammed his gloves down in the middle of the kitchen table. "Ranson, you never saw anything like it. 50 in the flock, 2 roosters, all in fine shape. Lice, of course, some bone malformation in the legs, but healthy." He began to ask me dozens of questions, but Ranson interrupted. "I need your help, Carter, and time's wasting. Among other depredations, George Henry here has been robbing government oyster beds, trapping government crabs, netting government fish, presumably at night. I needn't add that he has a ready and lucrative market. In effect, he refuses to cease his depredations, he refuses to join the WFI, and he is generally uncooperative." Carter said, "Uncooperative," in an absent way. He dragged his mind away from a flock of 50 fowl living in a most unusual ecology, narrowed his eyes and asked a shrewd question. "How did he get there?" "What?" "To the beds," Ranson said. "Where did you get the gas, George?" "I didn't. Took the engine out, put in a well and sent aboard, shipped a mask and rigged her for sail. She's tucked away up in Marshwater Creek." They were astounded. Nobody had sailed pleasure craft for a generation. No leisure and no money for such a waste of time, and sailcraft were too inefficient for food collecting. "My God, George," Ranson said, "you're a living anachronism." Carter nodded. He adjusted his glasses, looked at me, and said quietly, "He is also an able man." His abilities will be largely wasted in a penal food processing plant, Ranson said grimly. Oh, I agree, Carter nodded his head emphatically. The wrong environment entirely. No scope, no initiative. He gave me a glance of understanding that warmed me right through, and also had the unfortunate effect of taking some of the starch out of me. I had been prepared for hostility and indifference. I stood up and walked to the sink for a glass of water I didn't want. Now, Carter said, talking to Ranson, you take the way he walks. Notice how he swings his arms with his hands a little forward, as if ready to grip, and the tilt of his head, alert, watchful. You don't see that often. Different attitude, different environment. Ranson sighed. Get down to business. Yes, there's always this terrible lack of manpower, machine power, everything, all swallowed up in food. And besides, the men can't stand those bird stations. Too lonely, can't meet an emergency. 4 of them died on Rollins Island 3 winters ago when the power plant failed. Just sat there and froze. Terrible thing. Had to install emergency 2-way radios. Need the equipment elsewhere. They died of loneliness, if you ask me, Ranson said. Carter nodded. And no gas available for boat inspection. Helicopter too wasteful for a single station. Put George out there with 1 or 2 others. Could you sail out? Seaworthy? Big enough? I said yes. Good. Food processing all done by machines. Just feed birds in. Take up to half the colony of young birds when bred, half the old ones when coming to nest. Regular inspection of tern colonies by sail, your boat. Helicopter lands June 20, small freighter in July to load processed birds in Rollins Harbour. Just the thing. He took off his glasses to show that the problem had been solved. Look, Ranson said, I don't have anything against George personally. I want him to be useful and contented. If he can't be contented, then at least I want him to be useful instead of wasteful. Robbing government food resources is a grave offence, but even that doesn't justify putting him down in the middle of a pile of excrement where no ordinary man can breathe for more than a few minutes without stifling. Healthy, Carter said. Healthy. It does stink. That's one reason we have such trouble keeping the stations manned. Boys, I said, what is this pile of dung I'm supposed to sit on? And what birds? And why? Carter explained. In the desperate search for food, the seabirds were now being subjected to an annual harvest. From various nesting places along all the ocean coasts in the world, birds were harvested, to say nothing of their eggs, in large numbers. It was simply a matter of catching and killing the birds, gathering their eggs and feeding the processing hoppers with same. These foods were later shipped to food processing plants to be added to other harvests and packaged for consumption. In some cases, more specialised processing was necessary, as with the fulmars on Rollins Island. The fulmars were much prized because their alimentary system contained an especially stinking oil rich in fat and vitamin A. In their case, no eggs were collected, since they bred only once in a season, and the birds were separately processed to retrieve the oil. Literally millions of seabirds and their eggs were cropped yearly from nesting sites on the east coast of North America alone. It was a regular and assured source of food on an enormous scale the world over. The thousands of tons of excrement were also gathered every 5 years to be used in food processing and in agriculture. It was the policy of the WFI to waste nothing and to use everything. The cropping of the young birds took place in the spring and early summer, depending on the species. The adult birds were trapped by various devices when they returned to their nests. Overcropping was carefully avoided to ensure a steady annual production. If it's the island or a penal food plant, I'll take the island. I'm a waterman, not a bird collector. At least I'll get a chance to use the boat once in a while. Both the WFI men looked relieved. Then Ranson put a question. Do you know of anyone else around here who might be fitted for such work? I'm not asking you to inform. I know there's been a good deal of discontent in this Sound region, which is one reason why I'm here. The island may be a solution for other misfits as well. I thought it over. The Jackson boys aren't very happy. They were the best men with drift nets this Sound has ever seen. Now they sit on stools all day long and watch a row of bottles pass in front of lights. Once in a while they lift a bottle out of the line and put it aside. They get very drunk every night on some stuff they make out of berries and dandelions from the marsh. Ranson sighed. Carter again passed a warming look of complete understanding and nodded encouragement. Then there's Pete Younger. He was a trapper before WFI closed the muskrat areas. He turns a valve several hundred times a day in the small fish processor. He oils his traps and talks to himself. He may be too far gone. I think he is. Anyone else? Others, but the WFI has a bite on them for good, I guess. They were men once. Are the Jackson men married? I smiled. No, We're dying out, Carter chuckled. It was a 25-mile sail to Rollins Island. The Jackson boys and I loaded the boat with clothing mostly. Food was stored on the island. I took along 4 pairs of oyster rakes. I didn't have the heart to leave them behind. And Bill and Joy took a huge ball of linen twine, ropes, corks, rings, all the makings for a drift net. Unexpectedly, Carter showed up at the last minute by helicopter to see us off. He jumped up on the wharf, smiling. "About those chickens," he said. "They're condemned stock, of course. Better take them along, and keep an eye on them. Want to know how they make out in a new environment." Then he took me aside and handed me a small book. "Lot of information in this. Written by a small animal ecologist. Read it. Read it carefully. Think about it. Read it again and think some more. Got that?" I said, "Sure, I'll read it." I had the notion he was trying to get something over without actually coming out with it flat, so I listened carefully. He paused for a while, wiping his glasses and pursing his lips. "That island's not right for fulmars and gannets. Wrong environment. Never have multiplied as they should. Whole thing should be concentrated north. Plenty of cliff sites north. None here. Won't do. Terns, yes. Fulmars and gannets, no. Trouble is, WFI is tenacious, stupidly so. It works, they say. I tell them it works badly. It's going to take a lot to move them. Total failure of a colony or two. You're intelligent, George. Put 2 and 2 together. Wish you luck." He shook my hand quickly and jumped into the helicopter. Bill and Joy had to call me twice before I could come out of a trance of bewildered speculation. In a daze, I helped the boys load our last piece of equipment, a huge barrel of salt they had pilfered from the local food plant. The island is big, about 5 by 15 miles, and it must have been a fine piece of land. It still was, even though mucked everywhere with white to greenish bird dung. There were steep hills on the mainland side, marshes to seaward, and in the middle natural meadowland broken by woods containing pine and some beech and maple. We moored in a small but fairly deep harbour at a wharf for loading foods. Our barracks stood just off the wharf. In addition to all the necessities, there was a 2-way radio marked "Use in emergency only" and a handbook with information on approximate numbers of birds to be taken, locations of nesting sites, and so on. Equipment, including snares and nets, was stored in an equipment room. And there was a storeroom containing packaged foods, no freezing or cooling necessary for preservation. Behind the barracks stood a warehouse for storing processed birds, and a shop with the processors themselves. Everything looked orderly and efficient. A small plant supplied us with light and heat and power for the machines. We arrived in November. By December, the first seabirds began to return to their nesting sites, a few at a time. Soon we were so busy snagging them as they came to land that we had little time for anything but work and sleep. Even so, Bill took the time to salt several dozens of gannets and fulmars for future eating, and he was looking forward to the eggs. Spring and early summer soon rolled around and we were collecting young birds, the nestlings. So it went. I can't say any of us liked the work. For one thing, we all sickened of the endless slaughter. For another, the stench and dirt were overwhelming. The island should have been a fine place for living. There were sheltered spots for houses, a small harbour, woodlots, meadows for cattle and pigs, some bottomland for food crops, the sea for fish. A fine location. But it was ruined by birds. It was a slimy, stinking hell. The birds flew everywhere in huge flocks, especially in the morning when the gannets and fulmars came back from fishing at sea. Excrement fell from the sky like a stinking sleet. We couldn't get away from the smell or the smell away from us. It was in our clothing, hair, under our fingernails. No watermen ever washed so often or so thoroughly as we did, but the stink remained. We lost weight and appetite steadily, for the packaged food tasted of excrement soon after it was opened, or seemed to, which is just as bad. However, by the end of June most of the birds had left, and we had our helicopter inspection. The same man who was fascinated by the cold remains of a couple of eggs in my kitchen was on this route, and we cooked 3 or 4 of our chickens. His enormous appetite sharpened ours, and we had a feast. He was almost tearfully grateful. By July, the freighter had put in, loaded, and left. For the first time in many months, we were unoccupied. Bill and Joy immediately set about knitting a large drift net. They were happily excited at the prospect of gilling large numbers of government fish. As for me, I sat down to read a book on small animal ecology. I read that book through 3 times. I kept at it night and day, and it was the hardest work I've ever done, because I wasn't reading just to pass the time. There was a message in that book, I was sure of it. A message from Carter, a man I liked and trusted. By the time I began to get a glimmering of an idea as to what Carter's message was, the boys had their net knitted and hung. I went back to the book to find out what to do about this idea, and the boys sailed out to drift the net. I waited for them in a sweat of impatience. They came back at dawn the next day with a boatload of food fish. I met them at the wharf. "Bill," I said, "what are you going to do with that load of fish?" Bill looked at the fish. He said with slow and tremendous satisfaction, "I aim to eat them fish, George Henry." "Bill," I said, "not even you can eat all those fish. I've got a scheme. Save back some of the fish, sure. Let Joy smoke a few even. But take the rest into Murdoch tonight and sell them to Hornsby. He used to buy my oysters. He'll buy your fish." "What for?" Bill asked. "Get some bootleg gin," I said. "That makes sense. What else?" "Rats," I said. "I want rats. Buy some traps or get Pete Younger to make some. Not muskrats, barn rats. As many as you can catch." "Fish," Bill said. "Fish for rats. Boy, the birds has got you." He gave in after a while, more to keep me good-natured than for any other reason, that and the gin. He came back with 24 live, healthy specimens and watched with an open mouth as I let them loose. The months passed and I was worried. To drive the problem from my head, I took the boat out and surveyed the shallow waters off the island. I found something. I found a bed of oysters in broken rock, a bed not marked on WFI charts because you could see it hadn't been worked for a long time. Later I located clam beds on the marshy side of the island. The damn place was a paradise, or might be once those birds were cut down, but I couldn't eliminate them by sheer slaughter because of the WFI. There didn't seem to be many rats around. December came and all the filthy, stinking work with it, and still no rats. Once in a while eggs would be missing from occupied nests, and that was all. Gulls could have gotten those. We toiled through stinking February, foul March, odoriferous April, and evil-smelling May. Still no rats. I sent Bill back to the mainland for more, and by September, rats were everywhere. Bill looked at me from his bunk one night and said, "I hope you're satisfied." I was more than that. I was terrified. They absolutely swarmed. It was impossible to walk from the barracks to the boat at midday without having to kick rats off the path. They consumed most of the non-metallic gear in the boat, including the sail. So far they hadn't gnawed away into our barracks storeroom, or we'd have literally starved to death. "Boys," I said, "just sit tight. Wait till December. These rats are the best friends you ever had. They're going to make this island livable. No more stink and stench." "What," said Bill, "are you going to do with the rats when the birds are gone?" Joy merely moaned. "We'll kill them." "If they don't get us first," Bill said. It was an awesome and bloody slaughter. The fulmars and gannets, most of the gulls, some of the terns, were either wiped out or harried off the island in a single season. And the island became a heaving, moving, revolting mass of rats, and nothing but rats. They attacked us on sight from sheer hunger. Not a blade of grass grew anywhere on the island, and rats are not grass-eaters as an ordinary thing. There was one hopeful sign. They were beginning to eat each other. Day after day we were caged in our barracks. The constant squealing and scratching under the barracks was bad enough. What made us desperate was the fact that they had gnawed away into the storeroom and most of the packaged food was gone. We still had some smoked fish hung on the rafters and a few salted fulmars in the barrel, but that was all. It was then that we remembered the two-way radio marked "Use in emergency only." Bill said, after weighing all the evidence coolly and carefully, that this here, in his opinion, was an emergency. I got WFI mainland and finally persuaded them to put me in touch with Carter, Bird Station's ecologist. I told him we were having a little trouble with the genus Rattus, and would he, for God's sake, do something about it, quick. I can still hear him laughing. It was a while before he could speak at all. "Keep them at bay, General. I'll be over early tomorrow morning." I don't believe any men have ever been so happy to see Carter as we were. "They'll balance," he said. "Starvation will do its work. I've brought along a couple of pairs of barn owls. They'll help a lot. I see that you read that Ecology book. Good job. Station virtually wiped out. I'm sending supplies over in a week's time. Anybody wants to know, you're supposed to be helping extend and restore the tern and gull colonies. Wouldn't be a bad idea to try a few other animal experiments. Milder though, smaller scale. Send canvas for a sail too." He was gone before we could answer. The small freighter put in July 15th. She had no cargo of processed birds to take back, of course. The captain detailed a few men to unload our supplies and we helped them eagerly. There were 6 calves and heifers, 2 cows and a bull, 5 pigs, 1 boar and 2 sows, several dozen hens and a rooster. Best of all, there was a big case containing seeds, corn, barley, oats, seed potatoes, melons, beets, kale, dozens of others. A plough and 2 draft horses, mare and stallion, several pounds of rat poison, a hand forge and several tons of coke, iron, 100 pounds of linen twine for nets as well as ropes of all sizes, canvas, tools of all kinds, a big medical kit. In a year's time, we had prospered. No richer land, due to the bird droppings, was ever farmed, and the sandier areas could be depended upon for melons and other crops demanding a lighter, drier, and not so rich soil. Not only that, but we were 5 now instead of 3. The Jackson boys had lured a couple of husky girls to the island in the boat. The boys claimed the women fell in love with them. I think they fell in love with the island. This fast work on the part of the Jacksons seemed a little rash to me. I was still not at all sure we'd be allowed to remain and enjoy the work we had done. Several times I was tempted to use the radio again, but decided to wait. I'm glad now I did. In August, a little more than a year after his last visit, Carter set his helicopter down at the wharf again. After lunch in the barracks of baked fish, fresh milk, potatoes, salad and melons, he pulled back his chair and said, "I suppose you've been wondering." "We'd like to know," I said. He nodded. "The mainland's going to pieces. So is the whole world. It isn't just food. We can still produce that. Remember what you said about the bad roads, bad telephones? You put your finger on it. So much manpower, machinery, energy, material is used up in getting food and processing it and distributing it. There isn't enough for other things. 1/10 of the world's population and 1/4 of its total power resources go into processing plankton alone. We are literally eating ourselves to death. Utilities and services are breaking down rapidly. No new dwellings of any kind have been built for 10 years or more. Oil is short, cement, iron, steel, coal, plastics, wiring, radios, telephones, everything is in short supply and getting shorter. Transport is staggering to a halt." He paused, took off his glasses and twirled them by one side piece. "Many of us saw it coming. A few decided to do something. We thought there should be undisturbed nuclei, a few able people with ample food supplies. You are one such centre. There are others at various bird stations along the coast. You'll be joined shortly by a few more people, young men and women, among them a trained nurse, a doctor, a skilled carpenter, so on." Bill cleared his throat. "What you said, I guess it was all around me, only I never seen it, not to put together. Just one thing. The manager at the food plant, he used to stop and kid me about all the fish I stole from the government in my time. He was a-bragging about how WFI had newer and better ways of getting things done. Always newer and better every year. How come they couldn't keep caught up?" "Bill, those new techniques that manager talked about were old stuff 100, 200 years ago. The applications are new, some of them, but the basic ideas are old. The World Food Institute drew off all the scientific inventive brains of the world and put them to chasing food. No time for basic research, basic development. Just time for tinkering and retinkering old ideas. Been no new basic idea for a couple of centuries. Too much need for immediate practical results. The well is dry and it won't be filled again with a reservoir of new big ideas, not in our time. Been living off the past and the present has caught up with us." Before Carter left the island to visit the other stations, I had a chance to have a talk with him. "Was that sociologist Ranson in on this?" "No, we had to be careful. Still have to be. Just a few of us. That's why the loss of the bird colonies here had to seem natural, or at least a natural accident. And I had to keep clear of it. You can see that." "Carter, what happens on the mainland when things break up?" "Won't be pretty. Bad. Very bad." "For example?" "You read the Ecology book. What happens when a species multiplies beyond its ability to feed itself?" A dozen new Rollins Islanders showed up a few at a time in Carter's helicopter. We've been working and waiting a long time now, waiting for Carter to come back. For over a year now, our boat has made no crossing to the mainland. Last night, over 25 miles of sea in clear weather, we saw the sky lit by a great fire. I haven't forgotten those rats. I dream about them, tearing one another with bloody fangs. The Velvet Glove by Harry Harrison. Narrated by William Skye. New York was a bad town for robots this year. In fact, all over the country it was bad for robots. John Vennex fitted the key into the hotel room door. He had asked for a large room, the largest in the hotel, and paid the desk clerk extra for it. All he could do now was pray that he hadn't been cheated. He didn't dare complain or try to get his money back. He heaved a sigh of relief as the door swung open. It was bigger than he had expected, fully 3 feet wide by 5 feet long. There was more than enough room to work in. He would have his leg off in a jiffy, and by morning his limp would be gone. There was the usual adjustable hook on the back wall. He slipped it through the recessed ring in the back of his neck and kicked himself up until his feet hung free of the floor. His legs relaxed with a rattle as he cut off all power from his waist down. The overworked leg motor would have to cool down before he could work on it, plenty of time to skim through the newspaper. With the chronic worry of the unemployed, he snapped it open at the want ads and ran his eye down the help wanted robot column. There was nothing for him under the specialist heading. Even the unskilled labour listings were bare and unpromising. New York was a bad town for robots this year. The want ads were just as depressing as usual, but he could always get a lift from the comics section. He even had a favourite strip, a fact that he scarcely dared mention to himself. Rattly Robot, a dull-witted mechanical clod who was continually falling over himself and getting into trouble. It was a repellent caricature, but could still be very funny. John was just starting to read it when the ceiling light went out. It was 10 p.m., curfew hour for robots. Lights out and lock yourself in until 6 in the morning. 8 hours of boredom and darkness for all except the few night workers. But there were ways of getting around the letter of a law that didn't concern itself with a definition of visible light. Sliding aside some of the shielding around his atomic generator, John turned up the gain. As it began to run a little hot, the heat waves streamed out, visible to him as infrared rays. He finished reading the paper in the warm, clear light of his abdomen. The thermocouple in the tip of his second finger left hand, he tested the temperature of his leg. It was soon cool enough to work on. The waterproof gasket stripped off easily, exposing the power leads, nerve wires, and the weakened knee joint. The wires disconnected, John unscrewed the knee above the joint and carefully placed it on the shelf in front of him. With loving care, he took the replacement part from his hip pouch. It was the product of toil, purchased with his savings from 3 months' employment on the Jersey pig farm. John was standing on one leg testing the new knee joint when the ceiling fluorescent flickered and came back on. 5:30 already. He had just finished in time. A shot of oil on the new bearing completed the job. He stowed away the tools in the pouch and unlocked the door. The unused elevator shaft acted as waste chute. He slipped his newspaper through a slot in the door as he went by. Keeping close to the wall, he picked his way carefully down the grease-stained stairs. He slowed his pace at the 17th floor as 2 other mechs turned in ahead of him. They were obviously butchers or meat cutters. Where the right hand should have been on each of them, there stuck out a wicked foot-long knife. As they approached the foot of the stairs, they stopped to slip the knives into the plastic sheaths that were bolted to their chest plates. John followed them down the ramp into the lobby. The room was filled to capacity with robots of all sizes, forms, and colours. John Venex's greater height enabled him to see over their heads to the glass doors that opened onto the street. It had rained the night before, and the rising sun drove red glints from the puddles on the sidewalk. 3 robots, painted snow white to show they were night workers, pushed the doors open and came in. No one went out as the curfew hadn't ended yet. They milled around, slowly talking in low voices. The only human being in the entire lobby was the night clerk dozing behind the counter. The clock over his head said 5 minutes to 6. Shifting his glance from the clock, John became aware of a squat black robot waving to attract his attention. The powerful arms and compact build identified him as a member of the Digger family, one of the most numerous groups. He pushed through the crowd and clapped John on the back with a resounding clang. "John Venex, I knew it was you as soon as I saw you sticking up out of this crowd like a green tree trunk. I haven't seen you since the old days on Venus." John didn't need to check the number stamped on the short one's scratched chest plate. Alec Digger had been his only close friend during those 13 boring years at Orange Sea Camp. A good chess player and a whiz at two-handed handball, they had spent all their off time together. They shook hands with the extra squeeze that means friendliness. "Alec, you beat-up little grease pot. What brings you to New York?" "The burning desire to see something besides rain and jungle, if you must know. After you bought out, things got just too damn dull. I began working 2 shifts a day in that foul diamond mine, and then 3 a day for the last month to get enough credits to buy my contract and passage back to Earth. I was underground so long that the photocell on my right eye burned out when the sunlight hit." He leaned forward with a hoarse, confidential whisper. "If you want to know the truth, I had a 60-carat diamond stuck behind the eye lens. I sold it here on Earth for 200 credits, gave me 6 months of easy living. It's all gone now, so I'm on my way to the employment exchange." His voice boomed loud again. "And how about you?" John Vennex chuckled at his friend's frank approach to life. "It's just been the old routine with me. A run of odd jobs until I got sideswiped by a bus. It fractured my knee bearing. The only job I could get with a bad leg was feeding slops to pigs. Earned enough to fix the knee, and here I am." Alec jerked his thumb at a rust-coloured 3-foot-tall robot that had come up quietly beside him. "If you think you've got trouble, take a look at Dick here. That's no coat of paint on him. Dick Dryer, meet John Vennex, an old buddy of mine." John bent over to shake the little mech's hand. His eye shutters dilated as he realised what he had thought was a coat of paint was a thin layer of rust that coated Dick's metal body. Alex scratched a shiny path in the rust with his fingertip. His voice was suddenly serious. "Dick was designed for operation in the Martian desert. It's as dry as a fossil bone there, so his skinflint company cut corners on the stainless steel. When they went bankrupt, he was sold to a firm here in the city. After a while, the rust started to eat in and slow him down. They gave Dick his contract and threw him out." The small robot spoke for the first time, his voice grated and scratched. "Nobody will hire me like this, but I can't get repaired until I get a job." His arms squeaked and grated as he moved them. "I'm going by the robot-free clinic again today. They said they might be able to do something." Alec Digger rumbled in his deep chest. "Don't put too much faith in those people. They're great at giving out 10th credit oil capsules or a little free wire, but don't depend on them for anything important." It was 6 now. The robots were pushing through the doors into the silent streets. They joined the crowd, moving out, John slowing his stride so his shorter friends could keep pace. Dick Dryer moved with a jerking, irregular motion, his voice as uneven as the motion of his body. "John Vennex. I don't recognize your family name. Something to do with Venus, perhaps?" "Venus is right. Venus Experimental. There are only 22 of us in the family. We have waterproof, pressure-resistant bodies for working down on the ocean bottom. The basic idea was all right. We did our part. Only there wasn't enough money in the channel dredging contract to keep us all working. I bought out my original contract at half price and became a free robot." Dick vibrated his rusted diaphragm. "Being free isn't all it should be. I sometimes wish the Robot Equality Act hadn't been passed. I would just love to be owned by a nice rich company with a machine shop and a mountain of replacement parts." "You don't really mean that, Dick." Alec Digger clamped a heavy black arm across his shoulders. "Things aren't perfect now, we know that. But it's certainly a lot better than the old days. We were just hunks of machinery then. Used 24 hours a day until we were worn out and then thrown in the junk pile. No thanks. I'll take my chances with things as they are." John and Alec turned into the employment exchange, saying goodbye to Dick, who went on slowly down the street. They pushed up the crowded ramp and joined the line in front of the registration desk. The bulletin board next to the desk held a scattering of white slips announcing job openings. A clerk was pinning up new additions. Venex scanned them with his eyes, stopping at one circled in red. Robots needed in these categories. Apply at once to Chain Jet Limited, 1219 Broadway. Fasten, Flyer, Atomal, Filmer, Venex. John rapped excitedly on Alec Digger's neck. Look there, a job in my own specialty. I can get my old pay rate. See you back at the hotel tonight, and good luck in your job hunting. Alec waved goodbye. Let's hope the job's as good as you think. I never trust those things until I have my credits in my hand. John walked quickly from the employment exchange, his long legs eating up the blocks. Good old Alec. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't touch. Perhaps he was right, but why try to be unhappy? The world wasn't too bad this morning. His leg worked fine, prospects of a good job. He hadn't felt this cheerful since the day he was activated. Turning the corner at a brisk pace, he collided with a man coming from the opposite direction. John had stopped on the instant, but there wasn't time to jump aside. The obese individual jarred against him and fell to the ground. From the height of elation to the depths of despair in an instant, he had injured a human being. He bent to help the man to his feet, but the other would have none of that. He evaded the friendly hand and screeched in a high-pitched voice. Officer! Officer! Police! Help! I've been attacked! A mad robot! Help! A crowd was gathering, staying at a respectful distance, but making an angry muttering noise. John stood motionless, his head reeling at the enormity of what he had done. A policeman pushed his way through the crowd. Seize him, officer! Shoot him down! He struck me! Almost killed me! The man shook with rage, his words thickening to a senseless babble. The policeman had his .75 recoilless revolver out and pressed against John's side. This man has charged you with a serious crime, grease can. I'm taking you into the station house to talk about it. He looked around nervously, waving his gun to open a path through the tightly packed crowd. They moved back grudgingly, with murmurs of disapproval. John's thoughts swirled in tight circles. How did a catastrophe like this happen? Where was it going to end? He didn't dare tell the truth. That would mean he was calling the man a liar. There had been 6 robots power-lined in the city since the first of the year. If he dared speak in his own defence, there would be a jumper to the street lighting circuit and a 7th burnt-out hulk in the police morgue. A feeling of resignation swept through him. There was no way out. If the man pressed charges, it would mean a term of penal servitude, though it looked now as if he would never live to reach the court. The papers had been whipping up a lot of anti-robe feeling. You could feel it behind the angry voices, see it in the narrowed eyes and clenched fists. The crowd was slowly changing into a mob, a mindless mob as yet, but capable of turning on him at any moment. What's going on here? It was a booming voice with a quality that dragged at the attention of the crowd. A giant cross-continent freighter was parked at the curb. The driver swung down from the cab and pushed his way through the people. The policeman shifted his gun as the man strode up to him. That's my robot you got there, Jack. Don't put any holes in him. He turned on the man who had been shouting accusations. Fatty here is the world's biggest liar. The robot was standing here waiting for me to park the truck. Fatty must be as blind as he is stupid. I saw the whole thing. He knocks himself down walking into the robe, then starts hollering for the cops. The other man could take no more. His face crimson with anger, he rushed toward the trucker, his fists swinging in ungainly circles. They never landed. The truck driver put a meaty hand on the other's face and seated him on the sidewalk for the second time. The onlookers roared with laughter. The power lining and the robot were forgotten. The fight was between 2 men now. The original cause had slipped from their minds. Even the policeman allowed himself a small smile as he holstered his gun and stepped forward to separate the men. The trucker turned towards John with a scowl. Come on you, aboard the truck. You've caused me enough trouble for one day. What a junk can. The crowd chuckled as he pushed John ahead of him into the truck and slammed the door behind them. Jamming the starter with his thumb, he gunned the thunderous diesels into life and pulled out into the traffic. John moved his jaw, but there were no words to come out. Why had this total stranger helped him? What could he say to show his appreciation? He knew that all humans weren't robe-haters. Why, it was even rumoured that some humans treated robots as equals instead of machines. The driver must be one of these mythical individuals. There was no other way to explain his actions. Driving carefully with one hand, the man reached up behind the dash and drew out a thin, plasticoid booklet. He handed it to John, who quickly scanned the title, Robot Slaves in a World Economy, by Philpot Asimov II. If you're caught reading that thing, they'll execute you on the spot. Better stick it between the insulation on your generator. You can always burn it if you're picked up. Read it when you're alone. It's got a lot of things in it that you know nothing about. Robots aren't really inferior to humans. In fact, they're superior in most things. There is even a little history in there to show that robots aren't the first ones to be treated as second-class citizens. You may find it a little hard to believe, but human beings once treated each other just the way they treat robots now. That's one of the reasons I'm active in this movement. Sort of like the fellow who was burned helping others stay away from the fire. He smiled a warm, friendly smile in John's direction, the whiteness of his teeth standing out against the rich ebony brown of his features. I'm heading towards US 1. Can I drop you anywheres on the way? The Chainjet building, please. I'm applying for a job. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Before he opened the door, the driver shook hands with John. Sorry about calling you junk can, but the crowd expected it. He didn't look back as he drove away. John had to wait a half hour for his turn, but the receptionist finally signalled him towards the door of the interviewer's room. He stepped in quickly and turned to face the man seated at the transplastic desk, an upset little man with permanent worry wrinkles stamped in his forehead. The little man shoved the papers on the desk around angrily, occasionally making crabbed little notes on the margins. He flashed a bird-like glance up at John. Yes, be quick. What is it you want? You posted a help wanted notice. The man cut him off with a wave of his hand. All right, let me see your ID tag. Quickly, there are others waiting. John thumbed the tag out of his waist slot and handed it across the desk. The interviewer read the code number, then began running his finger down a long list of similar figures. He stopped suddenly and looked sideways at John from under his lowered lids. You have made a mistake. We have no opening for you. John began to explain to the man that the notice had requested his specialty, but he was waved to silence. As the interviewer handed back the tag, he slipped a card out from under the desk blotter and held it in front of John's eyes. He held it there for only an instant, knowing that the written message was recorded instantly by the robot's photographic vision and eidetic memory. The card dropped into the ashtray and flared into embers at the touch of the man's pencil heater. John stuffed the ID tag back into the slot and read over the message on the card as he walked down the stairs to the street. There were 6 lines of typewritten copy with no signature. To Venex Robot, you are urgently needed on a top-secret company project. There are suspected informers in the main office, so you are being hired in this unusual manner. Go at once to 787 Washington Street and ask for Mr. Coleman. John felt an immense sensation of relief. For a moment there, he was sure the job had been a false lead. He saw nothing unusual in the method of hiring. The big corporations were immensely jealous of their research discoveries and went to great lengths to keep them secret, at the same time resorting to any means to ferret out their business rivals' secrets. There might still be a chance to get this job. The burly bulk of a lifter was moving back and forth in the gloom of the ancient warehouse, stacking crates in ceiling-high rows. John called to him. The robot swung up his forklift and rolled over on noiseless tires. When John questioned him, he indicated a stairwell against the rear wall. Mr. Coleman's office is down in back. The door is marked. The lifter put his fingertips against John's ear pickups and lowered his voice to the merest shadow of a whisper. It would have been inaudible to human ears, but John could hear him easily, the sounds being carried through the metal of the other's body. "He's the meanest man you ever met. He hates robots, so be ever so polite. If you can use sir 5 times in one sentence, you're perfectly safe." John swept the shutter over one-eye tube in a conspiratorial wink. The large mech did the same as he rolled away. John turned and went down the dusty stairwell and knocked gently on Mr. Coleman's door. Coleman was a plump little individual in a conservative purple and yellow business suit. He kept glancing from John to the Robot General catalogue, checking the Venex specifications listed there. Seemingly satisfied, he slammed the book shut. "Gimme your tag and back against that wall to get measured." John laid his ID tag on the desk and stepped towards the wall. "Yes, sir. Here it is, sir." 2, sir, on that one. Not bad for the first sentence. He wondered idly if he could put 5 of them in one sentence without the man knowing he was being made a fool of. He became aware of the danger an instant too late. The current surged through the powerful electromagnet behind the plaster, flattening his metal body helplessly against the wall. Coleman was almost dancing with glee. "We got him, Juice. He's mashed flatter than a stinking tin can on a rock. Can't move a motor. Bring that junk in here and let's get him ready." Juice had a mechanic's coveralls on over his street suit and a toolbox slung under one arm. He carried a little black metal can at arm's length, trying to get as far from it as possible. Coleman shouted at him with annoyance. "That bomb can't go off until it's armed. Stop acting like a child. Put it on that grease can's leg and quick." Grumbling under his breath, Drew spot-welded the metal flanges of the bomb onto John's leg a few inches above his knee. Coleman tugged at it to be certain it was secure, then twisted a knob in the side and pulled out a glistening length of pin. There was a cold little click from inside the mechanism as it armed itself. John could do nothing except watch. Even his vocal diaphragm was locked by the magnetic field. He had more than a suspicion, however, that he was involved in something other than a secret business deal. He cursed his own stupidity for walking blindly into the situation. The magnetic field cut off, and he instantly raced his extensor motors to leap forward. Coleman took a plastic box out of his pocket and held his thumb over a switch inset into its top. "Don't make any quick moves, junkyard. This little transmitter is key to a receiver in that bomb on your leg. One touch of my thumb, up you go in a cloud of smoke and come down in a shower of nuts and bolts." He signalled to Druce, who opened a closet door. "And in case you want to be heroic, just think of him." Coleman jerked his thumb at the sodden shape on the floor, a filthily attired man of indistinguishable age, whose only interesting feature was the black bomb strapped tightly across his chest. He peered unseeingly from red-rimmed eyes and raised the almost empty whiskey bottle to his mouth. Coleman kicked the door shut. "He's just some Bowery bum we dragged in, Venex, but that doesn't make any difference to you, does it? He's human, and a robot can't kill anybody. That rummy has a bomb on him tuned to the same frequency as yours. If you don't play ball with us, he gets a 2-foot hole blown in his chest." Coleman was right. John didn't dare make any false moves. All of his early mental training, as well as Circuit 92 sealed inside his brain case, would prevent him from harming a human being. He felt trapped, caught by these people for some unknown purpose. Coleman had pushed back a tarpaulin to disclose a ragged hole in the concrete floor. The opening extended into the earth below. He waved John over. "The tunnel is in good shape for about 30 feet. Then you'll find a fool. Clean all the rock and dirt out until you break through into the storm sewer, then come back. And you better be alone. If you tip the cops, both you and the old stew go out together. Now move." The shaft had been dug recently and shored with packing crates from the warehouse overhead. It ended abruptly in a wall of fresh sand and stone. John began shoveling it into the little wheelbarrow they had given him. He had emptied 4 barrow loads and was filling the 5th when he uncovered the hand, a robot's hand made of green metal. He turned his headlight power up and examined the hand closely. There could be no doubt about it. These gaskets on the joints, the rivet pattern at the base of the thumb, meant only one thing. It was the dismembered hand of a Venex robot. Quickly yet gently, he shoveled away the rubble behind the hand and unearthed the rest of the robot. The torso was crushed and the power circuits shorted. Battery acid was dripping from an ugly rent in the side. With infinite care, John snapped the few remaining wires that joined the neck to the body and laid the green head on the barrow. It stared at him like a skull, the shutters completely dilated, but no glow of life from the tubes behind them. He was scraping the mud from the number on the battered chest plate when Nourse lowered himself into the tunnel and flashed the brilliant beam of a hand spot down its length.
"Stop playing with that junk and get digging, or you'll end up the same as him. This tunnel has got to be through by tonight."
John put the dismembered parts on the barrow with the sand and rock and pushed the whole load back up the tunnel, his thoughts running in unhappy circles. A dead robot was a terrible thing, and one of his family too. But there was something wrong about this robot, something that was quite inexplicable. The number on the plate had been 17, yet he remembered only too well the day that a water-shorted motor had killed Venex 17 in the Orange Sea. It took John 4 hours to drive the tunnel as far as the ancient granite wall of the storm sewer. Nourse gave him a short pinch bar, and he levered out enough of the big blocks to make a hole large enough to let him through into the sewer. When he climbed back into the office, he tried to look casual as he dropped the pinch bar to the floor by his feet and settled himself on the pile of rubble in the corner. He moved around to make a comfortable seat for himself, and his fingers grabbed the severed neck of Venex 17. Coleman swiveled around in his chair and squinted at the wall clock. He checked the time against his tie-pin watch. With a grunt of satisfaction, he turned back and stabbed a finger at John. "Listen, you green junk pile. At 1900 hours you're going to do a job, and there aren't going to be any slip-ups. You go down that sewer and into the Hudson River. The outlet is underwater, so you won't be seen from the docks. Climb down to the bottom and walk 200 yards north. That should put you just under a ship. Keep your eyes open, but don't show any lights. About halfway down the keel of the ship, you'll find a chain hanging. Climb the chain, pull loose the box that's fastened to the hull at the top, and bring it back here. No mistakes, or you know what happens." John nodded his head. His busy fingers had been separating the wires in the amputated neck. When they had been straightened and put into a row, he memorized their order with one flashing glance. He ran over the color code in his mind and compared it with the memorized leads. The 12th wire was the main cranial power lead. Number 6 was the return wire. With his precise touch, he separated these two from the pack and glanced idly around the room. Nourse was dozing on a chair in the opposite corner. Coleman was talking on the phone, his voice occasionally rising in a petulant whine. This wasn't interfering with his attention to John, and the radio switch still held tightly in left hand. John's body blocked Coleman's vision. As long as Nourse stayed asleep, he would be able to work on the head unobserved. He activated a relay in his forearm, and there was a click as the waterproof cover on an exterior socket swung open. This was a power outlet from his battery that was used to operate motorized tools and lights underwater. If Venex 17's head had been severed for less than 3 weeks, he could reactivate it. Every robot had a small storage battery inside his skull. If the power to the brain was cut off, the battery would provide the minimum standby current to keep the brain alive. The robe would be unconscious until full power was restored. John plugged the wires into his arm outlet and slowly raised the current to operating level. There was a tense moment of waiting, then 17's eye shutters suddenly closed. When they opened again, the eye tubes were glowing warmly. They swept the room with one glance, then focused on John. The right shutter clicked shut, while the other began opening and closing in rapid fashion. It was international code, being sent as fast as the solenoid could be operated. John concentrated on the message. "Telephone. Call emergency operator. Tell her signal 14. Help will..." The shutter stopped in the middle of a code group, the light of reason dying from the eyes. For one instant, John's heart leaped in panic, until he realized that 17 had deliberately cut the power. Druce's harsh voice rasped in his ear.
"What you doing with that? None of your funny robot tricks. I know your kind, plotting all kinds of things in them tin domes."
His voice tailed off into a stream of incomprehensible profanity. With sudden spite, he lashed his foot out and sent 17's head crashing against the wall. The dented green head rolled to a stop at John's feet, the face staring up at him in mute agony. It was only Circuit 92 that prevented him from injuring a human. As his motors revved up to send him hurtling forward, the control relays clicked open. He sank against the debris, paralyzed for the instant. As soon as the rush of anger was gone, he would regain control of his body. They stood as if frozen in a tableau. The robot slumped backward, the man leaning forward, his face twisted with unreasoning hatred. The head lay between them like a symbol of death. Coleman's voice cut through the air of tenseness like a knife. "Druce, stop playing with the grease can and get down to the main door to let little Willie and his junk brokers in. You can have it all to yourself afterward." The angry man turned reluctantly, but pushed out of the door at Coleman's annoyed growl. John sat down against the wall, his mind sorting out the few facts with lightning precision. There was no room in his thoughts for Druce. The man had become just one more factor in a complex problem. Call the emergency operator. That meant this was no local matter. Responsible authorities must be involved. Only the government could be behind a thing as major as this. Signal 14. That inferred a complex set of arrangements, forces that could swing into action at a moment's notice. There was no indication where this might lead, but the only thing to do was to get out of here and make that phone call. And quick. Druce was bringing in more people, junk brokers, whatever they were. Any action that he took would have to be done before they returned. Even as John followed this train of logic, his fingers were busy. Palming a wrench, he was swiftly loosening the main retaining nut on his hip joint. It dropped free in his hand, only the pivot pin remained now to hold his leg on. He climbed slowly to his feet and moved towards Coleman's desk. "Mr. Coleman, sir, it's time to go down to the ship now. Should I leave now, sir?" John spoke the words slowly as he walked forward, apparently going to the door, but angling at the same time towards the plump man's desk. "You got 30 minutes yet. Go say." The words were cut off. Fast as a human reflex is, it is the barest cruel compared to the lightning action of electronic reflex. At the instant Coleman was first aware of John's motion, the robot had finished his leap and lay sprawled across the desk, his leg off at the hip and clutched in his hand. "You'll kill yourself if you touch the button!" The words were part of the calculated plan. John bellowed them in the startled man's ear as he stuffed the dismembered leg down the front of the man's baggy slacks. It had the desired effect. Coleman's finger stabbed at the button, but stopped before it made contact. He stared down with bulging eyes at the little black box of death peeping out of his waistband. John hadn't waited for the reaction. He pushed backward from the desk and stopped to grab the stolen pinch bar off the floor. A mighty one-legged leap brought him to the locked closet. He stabbed the bar into the space between the door and frame and heaved. Coleman was just starting to struggle the bomb out of his pants when the action was over. The closet open, John seized the heavy strap holding the second bomb on the rummy's chest and snapped it like a thread. He threw the bomb into Coleman's corner, giving the man one more thing to worry about. It had cost him a leg, but John had escaped the bomb threat without injuring a human. Now he had to get to a phone and make that call. Coleman stopped tugging at the bomb and plunged his hand into the desk drawer for a gun. The returning men would block the door soon. The only other exit from the room was a frosted glass window that opened onto the mammoth bay of the warehouse. John Vennex plunged through the window in a welter of flying glass. The heavy thud of a recoilless 75 came from the room behind him, and a foot-long section of metal window frame leaped outward. Another slug screamed by the robot's head as he scrambled toward the rear door of the warehouse. He was a bare 30 feet away from the back entrance when the giant door hissed shut on silent rollers. All the doors would have closed at the same time, The thud of running feet indicated that they would be guarded as well. John hopped a section of packing cases and crouched out of sight. He looked up over his head. There stretched a webbing of steel supports, crossing and recrossing until they joined the flat expanse of the roof. To human eyes, the shadows there deepened into obscurity, but the infrared from a network of steam pipes gave John all the illumination he needed. The men would be quartering the floor of the warehouse soon. His only chance to escape recapture or death would be over their heads. Besides this, he was hampered by the loss of his leg. In the rafters, he could use his arms for faster and easier travel. John was just pulling himself up to one of the topmost crossbeams when a hoarse shout from below was followed by a stream of bullets. They tore through the thin roof. One slug clanged off the steel beam under his body. Waiting until 3 of the newcomers had started up a nearby ladder, John began to quietly work his way toward the back of the building. Safe for the moment, he took stock of his position. The men were spread out through the building. It could only be a matter of time before they found him. The doors were all locked and he had made a complete circuit of the building to be sure. There were no windows that he could force. The windows were bolted as well. If he could call the emergency operator, the unknown friends of Venex 17 might come to his aid. This, however, was out of the question. The only phone in the building was on Coleman's desk. He had traced the leads to make sure. His eyes went automatically to the cables above his head. Plastic gaskets were set in the wall of the building. Through them came the power and phone lines. The phone line! That was all he needed to make a call. With smooth, fast motions, he reached up and scratched a section of wire bare. He laughed to himself as he slipped the little microphone out of his left ear. Now he was half deaf as well as half lame. He was literally giving himself to this cause. He would have to remember the pun to tell Alec Digger later, if there was a later. Alec had a profound weakness for puns. John attached jumpers to the mic and connected them to the bare wire. A touch of the ammeter showed that no one was on the line. He waited a few moments to be sure he had a dial tone, then sent the 11 carefully spaced pulses that would connect him with a local operator. He placed the mic close to his mouth. "Hello, operator. Hello, operator. I cannot hear you, so do not answer. Call the emergency operator. Signal 14. I repeat, Signal 14. John kept repeating the message until the searching men began to approach his position. He left the mic connected. The men wouldn't notice it in the dark, but the open line would give the unknown powers his exact location. Using his fingertips, he did a careful traverse on an I-beam to an alcove in the farthest corner of the room. Escape was impossible. All he could do was stall for time. "Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry I ran away." With the volume on full, his voice rolled like thunder from the echoing walls. He could see the men below twisting their heads vainly to find the source. "If you let me come back and don't kill me, I will do your work. I was afraid of the bomb, but now I am afraid of the guns." It sounded a little infantile, but he was pretty sure none of those present had any sound knowledge of robotic intelligence. "Please let me come back, sir." He had almost forgotten the last word, so he added another, "Please, sir," to make up. Coleman needed that package under the boat very badly. He would promise anything to get it. John had no doubts as to his eventual fate. All he could hope to do was kill time in the hopes that the phone message would bring aid. "Come on down, junkie. I won't be mad at you if you follow directions." John could hear the hidden anger in his voice, the unspoken hatred for a robe who dared lay hands on him. The descent wasn't difficult, but John did it slowly, with much apparent discomfort. He hopped into the centre of the floor, leaning on the cases as if for support. Coleman and Druce were both there, as well as a group of hard-eyed newcomers. They raised their guns at his approach, but Coleman stopped them with a gesture. "This is my robe, boys. I'll see to it that he's happy." He raised his gun and shot John's remaining leg off. Twisted around by the blast, John fell helplessly to the floor. He looked up into the smoking mouth of the 75. "Very smart for a tin can, but not smart enough. We'll get the junk on the boat some other way.
Some way that won't mean having you around underfoot." Death looked out of his narrowed eyes. Less than 2 minutes had passed since John's call. The watchers must have been keeping 24-hour stations waiting for Venex 17's phone message. The main door went down with the sudden scream of torn steel. A whippet tank crunched over the wreck and covered the group with its multiple pom-poms. They were an instant too late. Coleman pulled the trigger. John saw the tensing trigger finger and pushed hard against the floor. His head rolled clear, but the bullet tore through his shoulder. Coleman didn't have a chance for a second shot. There was a fizzling hiss from the tank, and the riot ports released a flood of tear gas. The stricken men never saw the gas-masked police that poured in from the street. John lay on the floor of the police station while a tech made temporary repairs on his leg and shoulder. Across the room, Venex 17 was moving his new body with evident pleasure. "Now this really feels like something. I was sure my time was up when that landslip caught me, but maybe I ought to start from the beginning." He stamped across the room and shook John's inoperable hand. "The name is Will Counter 4951L3. Not that that means much anymore. I've worn so many different bodies that I forget what I originally looked like. I went right from factory school to a police training school, and I have been on the job ever since. Force of Detectives, Sergeant Junior grade, Investigation Department. I spend most of my time selling candy bars or newspapers, or serving drinks in crumb joints. Gather information, make reports, and keep tab on guys for other departments. This last job, and I'm sorry I had to use a Venex identity, I don't think I brought any dishonor to your family. I was on loan to the Customs Department. Seems a ring was bringing uncut junk, heroin, into the country. FBI tabbed all the operators here, but no one knew how the stuff got in. When Coleman, he's the local big shot, called the agencies for an underwater robot, I was packed into a new body and sent running. I alerted the squad as soon as I started the tunnel, but the damned thing caved in on me before I found out what ship was doing the carrying. From there on, you know what happened. Not knowing I was out of the game, the squad sat tight and waited. The hop merchants saw $500,000 in snow sailing back to the old country, so they had you dragged in as a replacement. You made the phone call, and the cavalry rushed in at the last moment to save 2 robots from a rusty grave." John, who had been trying vainly to get in a word, saw his chance as Will Counter turned to admire the reflection of his new figure in a window. "You shouldn't be telling me those things. About your police investigations and department operations. Isn't this information supposed to be secret? Especially from robots." "Of course it is," was Will's airy answer. "Captain Edgecombe, he's the head of my department, is an expert on all kinds of blackmail. I'm supposed to tell you so much confidential police business that you'll have to either join the department or be shot as a possible informer." His laughter wasn't shared by the bewildered John. "Truthfully, John, we need you and can use you. Robes that think fast and act fast aren't easy to find. After hearing about the tricks you pulled in that warehouse, the captain swore to decapitate me permanently if I couldn't get you to join up. Do you need a job? Long hours, short pay, but guaranteed to never get boring." Will's voice was suddenly serious. "You saved my life, John. Those snowbirds would have left me in that sand pile until all hell froze over. I'd like you for a mate. I think we could get along well together." The gay note came back into his voice. "And besides that, I may be able to save your life someday. I hate owing debts." The tech was finished. He snapped his toolbox shut and left. John's shoulder motor was repaired now. He sat up. When they shook hands this time, it was a firm clasp. The kind you know will last a while. John stayed in an empty cell that night. It was gigantic compared to the hotel and barrack rooms he was used to. He wished that he had his missing leg so he could take a little walk up and down the cell. He would have to wait until morning. They were going to fix him up then before he started the new job. He had recorded his testimony earlier, and the impossible events of the past day kept whirling around in his head. He would think about it some other time. Right now, all he wanted to do was let his overworked circuits cool down. If he only had something to read, to focus his attention on. Then, with a start, he remembered the booklet. Everything had moved so fast that the earlier incident with the truck driver had slipped his mind completely. He carefully worked it out from behind the generator shielding and opened the first page of Robot Slaves in a World Economy. A card slipped from between the pages, and he read the short message on it. Please destroy this card after reading. If you think there is truth in this book and would like to hear more, come to Room B, 107 George Street, any Tuesday at 5 p.m. The card flared briefly and was gone. But he knew that it wasn't only a perfect memory that would make him remember that message. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. The Snowball Effect by Katherine MacLean. Narrated by William Skye. Tack power drives on a sewing circle and you can needle the world into the darndest mess. All right, I said. What is sociology good for? Wilton Caswell, PhD, was head of my sociology department, and right then he was mad enough to chew nails. On the office wall behind him were 3 or 4 framed documents in Latin that were supposed to be signs of great learning, but I didn't care at that moment if he papered the walls with his degrees. I had been appointed dean and president to see to it that the university made money. I had a job to do, and I meant to do it. He bit off each word with great restraint. Sociology is the study of social institutions, Mr. Halloway. I tried to make him understand my position. Look, it's the big money men who are supposed to be contributing to the support of this college. To them, sociology sounds like socialism. Nothing can sound worse than that. And an institution is where they put Aunt Maggie when she began collecting Wheaties in a stamp album. We can't appeal to them that way. Come on now. I smiled condescendingly, knowing it would irritate him. What are you doing that's worth anything? He glared at me, his white hair bristling and his nostrils dilated like a warhorse about to whinny. I can say one thing for them. These scientists and professors always keep themselves well under control. He had a book in his hand and I was expecting him to throw it, but he spoke instead. This department's analysis of institutional accretion by the use of open system mathematics has been recognized as an outstanding and valuable contribution to... The words were impressive, whatever they meant, but this still didn't sound like anything that would pull in money. I interrupted. Valuable in what way? He sat down on the edge of his desk thoughtfully, apparently recovering from the shock of being asked to produce something solid for his position, and ran his eyes over the titles of the books that lined his office walls. Well, sociology has been valuable to business in initiating worker efficiency and group motivation studies, which they now use in management decisions. And of course, since the Depression, Washington has been using sociological studies of employment, labor, and standards of living as a basis for its general policies of... I stopped him with both raised hands. Please, Professor Caswell. That would hardly be a recommendation. Washington, the New Deal, and the present administration are somewhat touchy subjects to the men I have to deal with. They consider its value debatable, if you know what I mean. If they got the idea that sociology professors are giving advice and guidance... No, we have to stick to brass tacks and leave Washington out of this. What, specifically, has the work of this specific department done that would make it as worthy to receive money as... say, a heart disease research fund? He began to tap the corner of his book absently on the desk, watching me. Fundamental research doesn't show immediate effects, Mr. Halloway, but its value is recognized. I smiled and took out my pipe. All right, tell me about it. Maybe I'll recognize its value. Prof. Caswell smiled back tightly. He knew his department was at stake. The other departments were popular with donors and pulled in gift money by scholarships and fellowships and supported their professors and graduate students by research contracts with the government and industry. Caswell had to show a way to make his own department popular, or else. I couldn't fire him directly, of course, but there are ways of doing it indirectly. He laid down his book and ran a hand over his ruffled hair. Institutions, organizations, that is. His voice became more resonant. Like most professors, when he had to explain something, he instinctively slipped into his platform lecture mannerisms and began to deliver an essay. Have certain tendencies built into the way they happen to have been organized, which cause them to expand or contract without reference to the needs they were founded to serve. He was becoming flushed with the pleasure of explaining his subject. All through the ages, it has been a matter of wonder and dismay to men that a simple organization, such as a church to worship in, or a delegation of weapons to a warrior class merely for defense against an outside enemy, will either grow insensately and extend its control until it is a tyranny over their whole lives, or, like other organizations set up to serve a vital need, will tend to repeatedly dwindle and vanish and have to be painfully rebuilt. The reason can be traced to little quirks in the way they were organized, a matter of positive and negative power feedbacks. Such simple questions as, is there a way a holder of authority in this organization can use the power available to him to increase his power? Provide the key. But it still could not be handled until the complex questions of interacting motives and long-range accumulations of minor effects could somehow be simplified and formulated. In working on the problem, I found that the mathematics of open system, as introduced to biology by Ludwig von Bertalanffy and George Kreisler, could be used as a base that would enable me to develop a specifically social mathematics, expressing the human factors of intermeshing authority and motives in simple formulas. By these formulations, it is possible to determine automatically the amount of growth and period of life of any organization. The UN, to choose an unfortunate example, is a shrinker-type organization. Its monetary support is not in the hands of those who personally benefit by its governmental activities, but instead in the hands of those who would personally lose by any extension and encroachment of its authority on their own. Yet by the use of formula analysis— That's theory, I said. How about proof? My equations are already being used in the study of limited-size federal corporations. Washington— I held up my palm again. Please, not that nasty word again. I mean, where else has it been put into operation? Just a simple demonstration, something to show that it works, that's all. He looked away from me thoughtfully, picked up the book and began to tap it on the desk again. It had some unreadable title and his name on it in gold letters. I got the distinct impression again that he was repressing an urge to hit me with it. He spoke quietly. All right, I'll give you a demonstration. Are you willing to wait 6 months? Certainly, if you can show me something at the end of that time. Reminded of time, I glanced at my watch and stood up. Could we discuss this over lunch? He asked. I wouldn't mind hearing more, but I'm having lunch with some executors of a millionaire's will. They have to be convinced that by furtherance of research into human ills, he meant that the money should go to research fellowships for postgraduate biologists at the university rather than to a medical foundation. I see you have your problems too, Caswell said, conceding me nothing. He extended his hand with a chilly smile. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Holloway. I'm glad we had this talk. I shook hands and left him standing there, sure of his place in the progress of science and the respect of his colleagues, yet seething inside because I, the president and dean, had boorishly demanded that he produce something tangible. I frankly didn't give a hoot if he blew his lid. My job isn't easy. For a crumb of favourable publicity and respect in the newspapers and an annual ceremony in a silly costume, I spend the rest of the year going hat in hand, asking politely for money at everyone's door like a well-dressed panhandler, and trying to manage the university on the dribble I get. As far as I was concerned, a department had to support itself or be cut down to what student tuition pays for, which is a handful of overcrowded courses taught by an assistant lecturer. Caswell had to make it work or get out. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to hear what he was going to do for a demonstration. At lunch, 3 days later, while we were waiting for our order, he opened a small notebook. Ever hear of feedback effects? Not enough to have it clear. You know the snowball effect, though? Sure, start a snowball rolling downhill and it grows. Well, now, he wrote a short line of symbols on a blank page and turned the notebook around for me to inspect it. Here's the formula for the snowball process. It's the basic general growth formula, covers everything. It was a row of little symbols arranged like an algebra equation. One was a concentric spiral going up like a cross-section of a snowball rolling in snow. That was a growth sign. I hadn't expected to understand the equation, but it was almost as clear as a sentence. I was impressed and slightly intimidated by it. He had already explained enough so that I knew that if he was right, here was the growth of the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire, the conquests of Alexander, and the spread of the smoking habit and the change and rigidity of the unwritten law of styles. Is it really as simple as that? I asked. You notice, he said, that when it becomes too heavy for the cohesion strength of snow, it breaks apart. Now, in human terms, the chops and mashed potatoes and peas arrived. Go on, I urged. He was deep in the symbology of human motives and the equations of human behavior in groups. After running through a few different types of grower and shrinker-type organizations, we came back to the snowball and decided to run the test by making something grow. You add the motives, he said, and the equation will translate them into organization. How about a good selfish reason for the ins to drag others into the group? Some sort of bounty on new members, a cut of their membership fee? I suggested uncertainly, feeling slightly foolish. And maybe a reason why the members would lose if any of them resigned, and some indirect way they could use to force each other to stay in. The first is the chain letter principle, he nodded. I've got that. The other... He put the symbols through some mathematical manipulation so that a special grouping appeared in the middle of the equation. That's it. Since I seemed to have the right idea, I suggested some more and he added some and juggled them around in different patterns. We threw out a few that would have made the organization too complicated and finally worked out an idyllically simple and deadly little organization setup where joining had all the temptation of buying a sweepstakes ticket, going in deeper was as easy as hanging around a racetrack, and getting out was like trying to pull free from a Malayan thumb trap. We put our heads closer together and talked lower, picking the best place for the demonstration. Abington? How about Watershaw? I have some student sociological surveys of it already. We can pick a suitable group from that. This demonstration has got to be convincing. We'd better pick a little group that no one in his right mind would expect to grow. There should be a suitable club. Picture Professor Caswell, head of the Department of Sociology, and with him the president of the university, leaning across the table toward each other, sipping coffee and talking in conspiratorial tones over something they were writing in a notebook. That was us. Ladies, said the skinny female chairman of the Watershaw Sewing Circle, today we have guests. She signalled for us to rise and we stood up, bowing to polite applause and smiles. Professor Caswell and Professor Smith, my alias. They are making a survey of the methods and duties of the clubs of Watershaw. We sat down to another ripple of applause and slightly wider smiles, and then the meeting of the Watershaw Sewing Circle began. In 5 minutes I began to feel sleepy. There were only about 30 people there, and it was a small room, not the halls of Congress, but they discussed their business of collecting and repairing second-hand clothing for charity with the same endless, boring parliamentary formality. I pointed out to Caswell the member I thought would be the natural leader, a tall, well-built woman in a green suit with conscious gestures and a resonant, penetrating voice, and then went into a half-doze while Caswell stayed awake beside me and wrote in his notebook. After a while, the resonant voice roused me to attention for a moment. It was the tall woman holding the floor over some collective dereliction of the club. She was being scathing. I nudged Caswell and murmured, "Did you fix it so that a shover has a better chance of getting into office than a non-shover?" I think there's a way they could find for it, Caswell whispered back and went to work on his equation again. Yeah, several ways to bias the elections. Good. Point them out tactfully to the one you select. Not as if she'd use such methods, but just as an example of the reason why only she can be trusted with initiating the change. Just mention all the personal advantages an unscrupulous person could have. He nodded, keeping a straight and sober face, as if we were exchanging admiring remarks about the techniques of clothes repairing instead of conspiring. After the meeting, Caswell drew the tall woman in the green suit aside and spoke to her confidentially, showing her the diagram of organization we had drawn up. I saw the responsive glitter in the woman's eyes and knew she was hooked. We left the diagram of organization and our typed copy of the new bylaws with her, and went off soberly, as befitted two social science experimenters. We didn't start laughing until our car passed the town limits and began the climb for University Heights. If Caswell's equations meant anything at all, we had given that sewing circle more growth drives than the Roman Empire. 4 months later, I had time out from a very busy schedule to wonder how the test was coming along. Passing Caswell's office, I put my head in. He looked up from a student research paper he was correcting. Caswell, about that sewing club business. I'm beginning to feel the suspense. Could I get an advance report on how it's coming? I'm not following it. We're supposed to let it run the full 6 months. But I'm curious. Could I get in touch with that woman? What's her name? Searles, Mrs. George Searles. Would that change the results? Not in the slightest. If you want to graph the membership rise, it should be going up in a log curve, probably doubling every so often. I grinned. If it's not rising, you're fired. He grinned back. If it's not rising, you won't have to fire me. I'll burn my books and shoot myself. I returned to my office and put in a call to Watershaw. While I was waiting for the phone to be answered, I took a piece of graph paper and ruled it off into 6 sections, one for each month. After the phone had rung in the distance for a long time, a servant answered with a bored drawl. Mrs. Searles' residence? I picked up a red-gummed star and licked it. Mrs. Searles, please. She's not in just now. Could I take a message? I placed the star at the 30 line in the beginning of the first section. 30 members they'd started with. No thanks. Could you tell me when she'll be back? Not until dinner. She's at the meeting. The sewing club? I asked. No, sir, not that thing. There isn't a sewing club anymore, not for a long time. She's at the civic welfare meeting. Somehow I hadn't expected anything like that. Thank you, I said and hung up, and after a moment noticed I was holding a box of red-gummed stars in my hand. I closed it and put it down on top of the graph of membership in the sewing circle. No more members. Poor Caswell. The bet between us was ironclad. He wouldn't let me back down on it even if I wanted to. He'd probably quit before I put through the first slow move to fire him. His professional pride would be shattered, sunk without a trace. I remembered what he said about shooting himself. It had seemed funny to both of us at the time, but what a mess that would make for the university. I had to talk to Mrs. Searles. Perhaps there was some outside reason why the club had disbanded. Perhaps it had not just died. I called back. This is Professor Smith, I said, giving the alias I had used before. I called a few minutes ago. When did you say Mrs. Searles will return? About 6:30 or 7 o'clock. 5 hours to wait. And what if Caswell asked me what I had found out in the meantime? I didn't want to tell him anything until I had talked it over with that woman Searles first. Where is this civic welfare meeting? She told me. 5 minutes later I was in my car heading for Watershaw, driving considerably faster than my usual speed and keeping a careful watch for highway patrol cars as the speedometer climbed. The town meeting hall and theatre was a big place, probably with lots of small rooms for different clubs. I went in through the centre door and found myself in the huge central hall where some sort of rally was being held. A political type rally, you know, cheers and chants with bunting already down on the floor, people holding banners and plenty of enthusiasm and excitement in the air. Someone was making a speech up on the platform. Most of the people there were women. I wondered how the Civic Welfare League could dare hold its meeting at the same time as a political rally that could pull its members away. The group with Mrs. Sells was probably holding a shrunken and almost memberless meeting somewhere in an upper room. There probably was a side door that would lead upstairs. While I glanced around, a pretty girl usher put a printed bulletin in my hand, whispering, "Here's one of the new copies." As I attempted to hand it back, she retreated. "Oh, you can keep it. It's the new one. Everyone's supposed to have it. We've just printed up 6,000 copies to make sure there'll be enough to last." The tall woman on the platform had been making a driving, forceful speech about some plans for rebuilding Watershore's slum section. It began to penetrate my mind dimly as I glanced down at the bulletin in my hands. Civic Welfare League of Watershore, the united organization of church and secular charities. That's what it said. Below began the rules of membership. I looked up. The speaker, with a clear, determined voice and conscious, forceful gestures, had entered the home stretch of her speech and appealed to the civic pride of all citizens of Watershore. With a bright and glorious future, potentially without poor and without uncared for ill, potentially with no ugliness, no vistas which are not beautiful, the best people in the planned town in the country, the jewel of the United States. She paused and then leaned forward intensely, striking her clenched hand on the speaker's stand with each word for emphasis. All we need is more members. Now get out there and recruit. I finally recognized Mrs. Sells as an answering sudden blast of sound half deafened me. The crowd was chanting at the top of its lungs, "Recruit! Recruit!" Mrs. Sells stood still at the speaker's table, and behind her, seated in a row of chairs, was a group that was probably the board of directors. It was mostly women, and the women began to look vaguely familiar, as if they could be members of the sewing circle. I put my lips close to the ear of the pretty usher while I turned over the stiff printed bulletin on a hunch. How long has the League been organized? On the back of the bulletin was a constitution. She was cheering with the crowd, her eyes sparkling. I don't know, she answered between cheers. I only joined 2 days ago. Isn't it wonderful? I went into the quiet outer air and got into my car with my skin prickling. Even as I drove away, I could hear them. They were singing some kind of organization song with the tune of Marching Through Georgia. Even at the single glance I had given it, the Constitution looked exactly like the one we had given the Watershore Sewing Circle. All I told Caswell when I got back was that the Sewing Circle had changed its name and the membership seemed to be rising. Next day, after calling Mrs. Sells, I placed some red stars on my graph for the first 3 months. They made a nice curve, rising more steeply as it reached the 4th month. They had picked up their first increase in membership simply by amalgamating with all the other types of charity organizations in Watershore, changing the club name with each fusion, but keeping the same constitution. The constitution with the bright promise of advantages as long as there were always new members being brought in. By the 5th month, the League had added a mutual babysitting service and had induced the local school board to add a nursery school to the town service, so as to free more women for League activity. But charity must have been completely organised by then, and expansion had to be in other directions. Some real estate agents evidently had been drawn into the whirlpool early, along with their ideas. The slum improvement plans began to blossom and take on a tinge of real estate planning later in the month. The first day of the 6th month, a big 2-page spread appeared in the local paper of a mass meeting which had approved a full-fledged scheme for slum clearance of Watershore's Shack Town section, plus plans for rehousing, civic building and rezoning. And good prospects for attracting some new industries to the town, industries which had already been contacted and seemed interested by the privileges offered. And with all this, an arrangement for securing and distributing to the club members alone most of the profit that would come to the town in the form of a rise in the price of building sites and a boom in the building industry. The profit distributing arrangement was the same one that had been built into the organization plan for the distribution of the small profits of membership fees and honorary promotions. It was becoming an openly profitable business. Membership was rising more rapidly now. By the second week of the 6th month, news appeared in the local paper that the club had filed an application to incorporate itself as the Watershore Mutual Trade and Civic Development Corporation, and all the local real estate promoters had finished joining en masse. The mutual trade part sounded to me as if the Chamber of Commerce was on the point of being pulled in with them, ideas, ambitions, and all. I chuckled while reading the next page of the paper, on which a local politician was reported as having addressed the club with a long, flowery oration on their enterprise, charity, and civic spirit. He had been made an honorary member. If he allowed himself to be made a full member with its contractual obligations and its lures, if the politicians went into this too. I laughed, filing the newspaper with the other documents on the Watershore test. These proofs would fascinate any businessman with the sense to see where his bread was buttered. A businessman is constantly dealing with organizations, including his own, and finding them either inert, cantankerous, or both. Caswell's formula could be a handle to grasp them with. Gratitude alone would bring money into the university in carload lots. The end of the 6th month came. The test was over, and the end reports were spectacular. Caswell's formulas were proven to the hilt. After reading the last newspaper reports, I called him up. "Perfect, Wilt, perfect! I can use this Watershore thing to get you so many fellowships and scholarships and grants for your department that you'll think it's snowing money." He answered somewhat disinterestedly. "I've been busy working with students on their research papers and marking tests, not following the Watershore business at all, I'm afraid. You say the demonstration went well and you're satisfied?" He was definitely putting on a chill. We were friends now, but obviously he was still peeved whenever he was reminded that I had doubted that his theory could work. And he was using its success to rub my nose in the realization that I had been wrong. A man with a string of degrees after his name is just as human as anyone else. I had needled him pretty hard that first time. "I'm satisfied," I acknowledged. "I was wrong. The formulas work beautifully. Come over and see my file of documents on it if you want a boost for your ego. Now let's see the formula for stopping it." He sounded cheerful again. "I didn't complicate that organization with negatives. I wanted it to grow. It falls apart naturally when it stops growing for more than 2 months. It's like the great stock boom before an economic crash. Everyone in it is prosperous as long as the prices just keep going up and new buyers come into the market, but they all knew what would happen if it stopped growing. You remember, we built in as one of the incentives that the members know they are going to lose if membership stops growing. Why, if I tried to stop it now, they'd cut my throat." I remembered the drive and frenzy of the crowd in the one early meeting I had seen. They probably would. "No," he continued, "we'll just let it play out to the end of its tether and die of old age." "When will that be?" "It can't grow past the female population of the town. There are only so many women in Watershore, and some of them don't like sewing." The graph on the desk before me began to look sinister. Surely Caswell must have made some provision for... "You underestimate their ingenuity," I said into the phone. "Since they wanted to expand, they didn't stick to sewing. They went from general charity to social welfare schemes to something that's pretty close to an incorporated government. The name is now the Watershore Mutual Trade and Civic Development Corporation, and they're filing an application to change it to Civic Property Pool and Social Dividend, membership contractual, open to all. That social dividend sounds like a technocrat climbed on the bandwagon, eh?" While I spoke, I carefully added another red star to the curve above the 1,000-member level, checking with the newspaper that still lay open on my desk. The curve was definitely some sort of log curve now, growing more rapidly with each increase. Leaving out practical limitations for a moment, where does the formula say it will stop? I asked. When you run out of people to join it. But after all, there are only so many people in Watershaw. It's a pretty small town. They've opened a branch office in New York, I said carefully into the phone a few weeks later. With my pencil, very carefully, I extended the membership curve from where it was then. After the next doubling, the curve went almost straight up and off the page. Allowing for a lag of contagion from one nation to another, depending on how much their citizens intermingled, I'd give the rest of the world about 12 years. There was a long silence while Caswell probably drew the same graph in his own mind. Then he laughed weakly. Well, you asked me for a demonstration. That was as good an answer as any. We got together and had lunch in a bar, if you can call it lunch. The movement we started will expand by hook or by crook, by seduction or by bribery or by propaganda or by conquest, but it will expand. And maybe a total world government will be a fine thing until it hits the end of its rope in 12 years or so. What happens then, I don't know. But I don't want anyone to pin that on me. From now on, if anyone asks me, I've never heard of Watershaw. Remember to hit the like button. It will help this video spread and the channel grow, meaning I can narrate more stories like these. Thanks. Marley's Chain by Alan E. Nourse. Narrated by William Skye. Tam's problem was simple. He lived in a world that belonged to someone else. They saw Tam's shabby clothing and the small weather-beaten bag he carried, and they ordered him aside from the flow of passengers and checked his packet of passports and visas with extreme care. Then they ordered him to wait. Tam waited, a chilly apprehension rising in his throat. For 15 minutes he watched them helplessly. Finally, the spaceport was empty, and the huge liner from the outer asteroid rings was being lifted and rolled by the giant hooks and cranes back into its berth for dry dock and repair, her curved meteor-dented hull gleaming dully in the harsh arc lights. Tam watched the creaking cranes and shivered in the cold night air, feeling hunger and dread gnawing at his stomach. There was none of the elation left, none of the great, expansive, soothing joy at returning to Earth after 8 long years of hard work and bitterness. Only the cold, corroding uncertainty, the growing apprehension. Times had changed since that night back in 87, just how much he hardly dared to guess. All he knew was the rumours he had heard, the whispered tales, the frightened eyes and the scarred backs and faces. Tam hadn't believed them then, so remote from Earth. He had just laughed and told himself that the stories weren't true. And now they all welled back into his mind, tightening his throat and making him tremble. "Hey, Sharky, come here." Tam turned and walked slowly over to the customs official who held his papers. "Everything's in order," he said, half defiantly, looking up at the officer's impassive face. "There isn't any mistake." "What were you doing in the rings, Sharky?" The officer's voice was sharp. "Indenture. Working off my fare back home." The officer peered into Tam's face incredulously. "And you come back here?" He shook his head and turned to the other officer. "I knew these Sharkies were dumb, but I didn't think they were that dumb." He turned back to Tam, his eyes suspicious. "What do you think you're going to do now?" Tam shrugged uneasily. "Get a job," he said. "A man's got to eat." The officers exchanged glances. "How long you been on the rings?" 8 years. Tam looked up at him anxiously. "Can I have my papers now?" A cruel grin played over the officer's lips. "Sure," he said, handing back the packet of papers. Happy job hunting, he added sardonically. But remember, the ship's going back to the rings in a week. You can always sign yourself over for fare. I know, said Tam, turning away sharply. I know all about how that works. He tucked the papers carefully into a tattered breast pocket, hefted the bag wearily, and began trudging slowly across the cold concrete of the port toward the street and the underground. A wave of loneliness, almost overpowering in intensity, swept over him, a feeling of emptiness, bleak and hopeless. A chilly night wind swept through his unkempt blonde hair as the automatics let him out into the street, and he saw the large, dirty, New Denver Underground sign with the arrow at the far side of the road. Off to the right, several miles across the high mountain plateau, the great capital city loomed up, shining like 1,000 twinkling stars in the clear, cold air. Tam jingled his last few coins listlessly and started for the downward ramp. Somewhere down there, he could find a darkened corner, maybe even a bench where the police wouldn't bother him for a couple of hours. Maybe after a little sleep, he'd find some courage hidden away somewhere. Just enough to walk into an office and ask for a job. That, he reflected wearily as he shuffled into the tunnel, would take a lot of courage. The girl at the desk glanced up at him, indifferent, and turned her eyes back to the letter she was typing. Tam Peters continued to stand awkwardly, his blonde hair rumpled, little crow's feet of weariness creeping from the corners of his eyes. Slowly he looked around the neat office, feeling a pang of shame at his shabby clothes. He should at least have found some way to shave, he thought, some way to take some of the rumple from his trouser legs. He looked back at the receptionist and coughed lightly. She finished her letter at a leisurely pace and finally looked up at him, her eyes cold. "Well?" "I read your ad. I'm looking for a job. I'd like to speak to Mr. Randall." The girl's eyes narrowed, and she took him in a rapid, sweeping glance, his high, pale forehead, the shock of mud-blonde hair, the thin, sensitive face with the exaggerated lines of approaching middle age, the slightly misty blue eyes. It seemed to Tam that she stared for a full minute, and he shifted uneasily, trying to meet the cold inspection, and failing, finally settling his eyes on her prim, neatly manicured fingers. Her lip curled very slightly. "Mr. Randall can't see you today. He's busy. Try again tomorrow." She turned back to typing. A flat wave of defeat sprang up in his chest. "The ad said to apply today. The earlier the better." She sniffed indifferently and pulled a long white sheet from the desk. "Have you filled out an application?" "No." "You can't see Mr. Randall without filling out an application." She pointed to a small table across the room, and he felt her eyes on his back as he shuffled over and sat down. He began filling out the application with great care, making the printing as neat as he could with the old-style vacuum pen provided. Name, age, sex, race, nationality, planet where born, pre-revolt experience, post-revolt experience, preference. Try as he would, Tam couldn't keep the ancient pen from leaking, making an unsightly blot near the center of the form. Finally, he finished and handed the paper back to the girl at the desk. Then he sat back and waited. Another man came in, filled out a form, and waited too, shooting Tam a black look across the room. In a few moments, the girl turned to the man. "Robert Stover?" "Yeah," said the man, lumbering to his feet. "That's me." "Mr. Randall will see you now." The man walked heavily across the room, disappeared into the back office. Tam eyed the clock uneasily, still waiting. A garish picture on the wall caught his eyes, a large, very poor oil portrait of a very stout greying man dressed in a ridiculous green suit with a little white turban-like affair on the top of his head. Underneath was a little brass plaque with words Tam could barely make out. Abraham L. Farrell, 1947 to 1986. Founder and first president, Marsport Mines Incorporated. Unto such men as these we look to leadership. Tam stared at the picture, his lip curling slightly. He glanced anxiously at the clock as another man was admitted to the small back office. Then another man. Anger began creeping into Tam's face, and he fought to keep the scowl away, to keep from showing his concern. The hands of the clock crept around, then around again. It was almost noon. Not a very new dodge, Tam thought coldly. Not very new at all. Finally, the small cold flame of anger got the better of him, and he rose and walked over to the desk. "I'm still here," he said patiently. "I'd like to see Mr. Randall." The girl stared at him indignantly and flipped an intercom switch. "That Peters application is still out here," she said brittly. "Do you want to see him or not?" There was a moment of silence. Then the voice on the intercom grated. "Yes, I guess so. Send him in." The office was smaller, immaculately neat. 2 visiphone units hung on a switchboard at the man's elbow. Tam's eyes caught the familiar equipment, recognized the interplanetary power coils on one. Then he turned his eyes to the man behind the desk. "Now then, what are you after?" asked the man, settling his bulk down behind the desk, his eyes guarded, revealing a trace of boredom. Tam was suddenly bitterly ashamed of his shabby appearance, the 2-day stubble on his chin. He felt a dampness on his forehead and tried to muster some of the old power and determination into his voice. "I need a job," he said. "I've had plenty of experience with radio electronics and remote control power operations. I'd make a good mine operator. I can read," the man cut in sharply, gesturing toward the application form with the ink blot in the middle. "I read all about your experience. But I can't use you. There aren't any more openings." Tam's ears went red. "But you're always advertising," he countered. "You don't have to worry about me working on Mars either. I've worked on Mars before, and I can work 6, 7 hours even without a mask or equipment." The man's eyebrows raised slightly. "How very interesting," he said flatly. "The fact remains that there aren't any jobs open for you." The cold, angry flame flared up in Tam's throat suddenly, forcing out the sense of futility and defeat. "Those other men," he said sharply. "I was here before them. That girl wouldn't let me in." Randall's eyes narrowed amusedly. "What a pity," he said sadly. "And just think, I hired every one of them." His face suddenly hardened, and he sat forward, his eyes glinting coldly. "Get smart, Peters. I think Marsport Mines can somehow manage without you. You or any other sharky. The men just don't like to work with sharkies." Rage swelled up in Tam's chest, bitter, futile rage, beating at his temples and driving away all thought of caution. "Look," he grated, bending over the desk threateningly. "I know the law of this system. There's a Fair Employment Act on the books. It says that men are to be hired by any company in order of application when they qualify equally in experience. I can prove my experience." Randall stood up, his face twisted contemptuously. "Get out of here," he snarled. "You've got nerve, you have. Come crawling in here with your law. Where do you think you are?" His voice grated in the still air of the office. "We don't hire sharkies, law or no law. Get that? Now get out of here." Tam turned, his ears burning, and strode through the office blindly, kicking open the door and almost running to the quiet air of the street outside. The girl at the desk yawned and snickered and went back to her typing with an unpleasant grin. Tam walked the street, block after block, seething, futile rage swelling up and bubbling over, curses rising to his lips, clipped off with some last vestige of self-control. At last, he turned into a small downtown bar and sank wearily onto a stool near the door. The anger was wearing down now to a sort of empty, hopeless weariness, dulling his senses, exaggerating the hunger in his stomach. He had expected it, he told himself. He had known what the answer would be, but he knew that he had hoped, against hope, against what he had known to be the facts, hoped desperately that maybe someone would listen. Oh, he knew the laws all right, but he'd had plenty of time to see the courts in action. Unfair employment was almost impossible to make stick under any circumstances, but with the courts rigged the way they were these days... He sighed and drew out one of his last credit coins. "Beer," he muttered as the barkeep looked up. The bartender scowled, his heavy-set face a picture of fashionable distaste. Carefully he filled every other order at the bar. Then he grudgingly set up a small beer, mostly foam, and flung some small coin change down on the bar before Tam. Tam stared at the glass, the little proud flame of anger flaring slowly. A fat man sitting nearby stared at him for a long moment, then took a long swill of beer from his glass. "Smatter, Sharky, why don't you drink your beer and get the hell out of here?" Tam stared fixedly at his glass, giving no indication of having heard a word. The fat man stiffened a trifle, swung around to face him. "Goddamn Sharky's too good to talk to a guy," he snarled loudly. "What's the matter, Sharky? You deaf?" Tam's hand trembled as he reached for the beer, took a short swallow. Shrugging, he set the glass on the bar and got up from his stool. He walked out, feeling many eyes on his back. He walked. Time became a blur to a mind beaten down by constant rebuff. He became conscious of great weariness of both mind and body. Instinct screamed for rest. Tam sat up, shaking his head to clear it. He shivered from the chill of the park, the cruel pressure of the bench. He pulled up his collar and moved out into the street again. There was one last chance. Cautiously his mind skirted the idea, picked it up, regarded it warily, then threw it down again. He had promised himself never to consider it years before, in the hot, angry days of the revolt. Even then he had had some inkling of the shape of things, and he had promised himself bitterly never to consider that last possibility. Still. Another night in the cold out of doors could kill him. Suddenly he didn't care anymore, didn't care about promises or pride or anything else. He turned into a public telephone booth, checked an address in the thick New Denver book. He knew he looked frightful as he stepped onto the elevator, felt the cold eyes turn away from him in distaste. Once he might have been mortified, felt the deep shame creeping up his face, but he didn't care any longer. He just stared ahead at the moving panel, avoiding the cold eyes, until the 5th floor was called. The office was halfway down the dark hallway. He saw the sign on the door dimly, United Continents Bureau of Employment, and down in small letters below, Planetary Division David G. Hawke. Tam felt the sinking feeling in his stomach and opened the door apprehensively. It had been years since he had seen Dave, long years filled with violence and change. Those years could change men, too. Tam thought, fearfully, they could make even the greatest men change. He remembered briefly his promise to himself, made just after the revolt, never to trade on past friendships, never to ask favours of those men he had known before and befriended. With a wave of warmth, the memory of those old days broke through, those days when he had roomed with Dave Hawke, the long, probing talks, the confidences, the deep, rich knowledge that they had shared each other's dreams and ideals, that they had stood side by side for a common cause, though they were such different men from such very different worlds. Ideals had been cheap in those days, talk easy, but still, Tam knew that Dave had been sincere, a firm, stout friend. He had known then the sincerity in the big lad's quiet voice, felt the rebellious fire in his eyes. They had understood each other then, deeply, sympathetically, in spite of the powerful barrier they sought to tear down. The girl at the desk caught his eye, looked up from her work without smiling. "Yes?" My name is Tam Peters. I'd like to see Mr. Hawke. His voice was thin, reluctant, reflecting overtones of the icy chill in his chest. So much had happened since those long dead days, so many things to make men change. The girl was grinning, her face like a harsh mask. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice brittle. Anger flooded Tam's face. "Listen," he hissed. "I didn't ask for your advice. I asked to see Dave Hawke. If you choose to announce me now, that's fine. If you don't see fit, then I'll go in without it. And you won't stop me." The girl stiffened, her eyes angry. "You'd better not get smart," she snapped, watching him warily. "There are police in the building. You'd better not try anything, or I'll call them." "That's enough, Miss Jackson." The girl turned to the man in the office door, her eyes disdainful. The man stood in the doorway, a giant with curly black hair above a high, intelligent forehead, dark, brooding eyes gleaming like live coals in the sensitive face. Tam looked at him, and suddenly his knees would hardly support him, and his voice was a tight whisper. "Dave!" And then the huge man was gripping his hand, a strong arm around his thin shoulders, the dark, brooding eyes soft and smiling. Tam, it's been so damned long, man. Oh, it's good to see you, Tam. Why, the last I heard, you'd taken passage to the Rings years ago." Weakly, Tam stumbled into the inner office, sank into a chair, his eyes overflowing, his mind a turmoil of joy and relief. The huge man slammed the door to the outer office and settled down behind the desk, sticking his feet over the edge, beaming. "Where have you been, Tam? You promised you'd look me up any time you came to New Denver, and I haven't seen you in a dozen years." He fished in a lower drawer. "Drink?" No, thanks. I don't think I could handle a drink." Tam sat back, gazing at the huge man, his throat tight. "You look bigger and better than ever, Dave." Dave Hawke laughed, a deep bass laugh that seemed to start at the soles of his feet. "Couldn't very well look thin and wan," he said. He pushed a cigar box across the desk. "Here, light up. I'm on these exclusively these days. Remember how you tried to get me to smoke them back at the university? How you couldn't stand cigarettes? Said they were for women. A man should smoke a good cigar. You finally converted me." Tam grinned, suddenly feeling the warmth of the old friendship swelling back. "Yes, I remember. You were smoking that rotten corn cob then, because old Prof. Tenley smoked one that you could smell in the back of the room, and in those days the prof could do no wrong." Dave Hawke grinned broadly, settled back in his chair as he lit the cigar. "Yes, I remember. Still got that corn cob around somewhere." He shook his head, his eyes dreamy. "Good old Prof. Tenley. 1 in a million. There was an honest man, Tam. They don't have them like that in the colleges these days. Wonder what happened to the old goat." "He was killed," said Tam softly, "just after the war. Got caught in a revolt riot and he was shot down." Dave looked at him, his eyes suddenly sad. "A lot of honest men went down in those riots, didn't they? That was the worst part of the revolt. There wasn't any provision made for the honest men, the really good men." He stopped and regarded Tam closely. "What's the trouble, Tam? If you'd been going to make a friendly call, you'd have done it years ago. You know this office has always been open to you." Tam stared at his shoe, carefully choosing his words, lining them up in his mind, a frown creasing his forehead. "I'll lay it on the line," he said in a low voice. "I'm in a spot. That passage to the Rings wasn't voluntary. I was shanghaied onto a freighter and had to work for 8 years without pay to get passage back. I'm broke and I'm hungry and I need to see a doctor." "Well, hell!" the big man exploded. "Why didn't you holler sooner? Look, Tam, we've been friends for a long time. You know better than to hesitate." He fished for his wallet. "Here, I can let you have as much as you need. Couple hundred?" No, that's not what I'm getting at." Tam felt his face flush with embarrassment. I need a job, Dave. I need one bad. Dave sat back and his feet came off the desk abruptly. He didn't look at Tam. I see, he said softly. A job. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Tell you what, he said. The government's opening a new uranium mine in a month or so. Going to be a big project. They'll need lots of men. On Mercury. Tam's eyes fell, a lump growing in his throat. Mercury, he repeated dully. Why, sure, Tam. Good pay, chance for promotion. I'd be dead in 6 months on Mercury. Tam's eyes met Dave's, trying to conceal the pain. You know that as well as I do, Dave. Dave looked away. Oh, the docs don't know what they're talking about. You know perfectly well that they do. I couldn't even stand Venus very long. I need a job on Mars, Dave, or on Earth. Yes, said Dave Hawke sadly. I guess you're right. He looked straight at Tam, his eyes sorrowful. The truth is, I can't help you. I'd like to, but I can't. There's nothing I can do. Tam stared, the pain of disillusionment sweeping through him. Nothing you can do? He exploded. But you're the director of this bureau. You know every job open on every one of the planets. I know, and I have to help get them filled. But I can't make anyone hire, Tam. I can send applicants and recommendations until I'm blue in the face, but I can't make a company hire. He paused, staring at Tam. Oh, hell, he snarled suddenly, his face darkening. Let's face it, Tam. They won't hire you. Nobody will hire you. You're a sharky, and that's all there is to it. They aren't hiring sharkies. And there's nothing I can do to make them. Tam sat as if he had been struck, the colour draining from his face. But the law. Dave, you know there's a law. They have to hire us if we apply first and have the necessary qualifications. The big man shrugged uneasily. Sure, there's a law, but who's going to enforce it? Tam looked at him, a desperate tightness in his throat. You could enforce it. You could if you wanted to. The big man stared at him for a moment, then dropped his eyes, looked down at the desk. Somehow this big body seemed smaller, less impressive. I can't do it, Tam. I just can't. They'd have to listen to you. Tam's face was eager. You've got enough power to put it across. The court would have to stick to the law. I can't do it. Dave drew nervously on his cigar, and the light in his eyes seemed duller now. If it were just me, I wouldn't hesitate a minute. But I've got a wife, a family. I can't jeopardize them. Dave, you know it would be the right thing. Oh, the right thing be damned. I can't go out on a limb, I tell you. There's nothing I can do. I can let you have money, Tam, as much as you need. I could help you set up in business, maybe, or anything. But I can't stick my neck out like that. Tam sat stiffly, coldness seeping down into his legs. Deep in his heart he had known that this was what he had dreaded. Not the fear of rebuff, not the fear of being snubbed, unrecognized, turned out. That would have been nothing compared to this change in the honest, forthright, fearless Dave Hawke he had once known. What's happened, Dave? Back in the old days you would have leaped at such a chance. I would have... The shoe was on the other foot then. We talked, Dave. Don't you remember how we talked? We were friends. You can't forget that. I know you. I know what you believe, what you think. How can you let yourself down? Dave Hawke's eyes avoided Tam's. Times have changed. Those were the good old days, back when everybody was happy, almost. Everybody but me and a few others. At least it looked that way to you. But those days are gone. They'll never come back. This is a reaction period, and the reaction is bitter. There isn't any place for fighters now. The world is just the way people want it, and nobody can change it. What do you expect me to do? He stopped, his heavy face contorted, a line of perspiration on his forehead. I hate it, he said finally, but my hands are tied. I can't do anything. That's the way things are. But why? Tam Peters was standing, eyes blazing, staring down at the big man behind the desk, the bitterness of long, weary years tearing into his voice, almost blinding him. Why is that the way things are? What have I done? Why do we have this mess where a man isn't worth any more than the colour of his skin? Dave Hawke slammed his fist on the desk and his voice roared out in the close air of the office. Because it was coming, he bellowed. It's been coming, and now it's here, and there's nothing on God's earth can be done about it. Tam's jaw sagged, and he stared at the man behind the desk. Dave, think what you're saying, Dave. I know right well what I'm saying, Dave Hawke roared, his eyes burning bitterly. Oh, you have no idea how long I've thought, the fight I've had with myself, the sacrifices I've had to make. You weren't born like I was. You weren't raised on the wrong side of the fence. Well, there was an old Christmas story that I used to read, years ago before they burned the Sharky books. It was about an evil man who went through life cheating people, hating and hurting people, and when he died, he found that every evil deed he had ever done had become a link in a heavy iron chain, tied and shackled to his waist. And he wore that chain he had built up, and he had to drag it from one eternity to the next. His name was Marley, remember? Dave, you're not making sense. Oh yes, all kinds of sense. Because you Sharkies have a chain too. You started forging it around your ankles back in the classical Middle Ages of Earth. Year by year you built it up, link by link, built it stronger, heavier. You could have stopped it any time you chose, but you didn't ever think of that. You spread over the world, building up your chain, assuming that things would always be just the way they were, just the way you wanted them to be. The big man stopped, breathing heavily, a sudden sadness creeping into his eyes, his voice taking on a softer tone. You were such fools, he said softly. You waxed and grew strong and clever and confident, and the more power you had, the more you wanted. You fought wars, and then bigger and better wars, until you couldn't be satisfied with gunpowder and TNT any longer. And finally, you divided your world into two armed camps and brought fury out of her box, fought with the power of the atoms themselves, you clever Sharkies. And when the dust settled and cooled off, there weren't very many of you left. Lots of us, it was your war, remember, but not very many of you. Of course, there was a revolt then, and all the boxed-up, driven-in hatred and bloodshed boiled up and over, and you Sharkies at long last got your chain tied right around your waists. You were a long, long time building it, and now you can wear it. Tam's face was chalky. Dave, there were some of us. You know there were many of us that hated it as much as you did before the revolt. Some of us fought. Some of us at least tried. The big man nodded his head bitterly. You thought you tried, sure. It was the noble thing to do, the romantic thing, the good thing to do. But you didn't really believe it. I know. I thought there was some hope back then, some chance to straighten things out without a revolt. For a long time I thought that you, and those like you, really meant all you were saying. I thought somehow we could find an equal footing, an end to the hatred and bitterness. But there wasn't any end, and you never really thought there ever would be. That made it so safe. It would never succeed. So when things were quiet, it was a nice idea to toy around with, this equality for all, a noble project that couldn't possibly succeed. But when things got hot, it was a different matter. He stared at Tam, his dark eyes brooding. Oh, it wasn't just you, Tam. You were my best friend, even though it was a hopeless, futile friendship. You tried. You did the best you could, I know. But it just wasn't true, Tam. When it came to the pinch, to a real jam, you would have been just like the rest, basically. It was built up in you, drummed into you until no amount of fighting could ever scour it out." Dave Hawkes stood up, walked over to the window, staring out across the great city. Tam watched him, the blood roaring in his ears, hardly able to believe what he had heard from the big man, fighting to keep his mind from sinking into total confusion. Somewhere a voice deep within him seemed to be struggling through with confirmation, telling him that Dave Hawke was right, that he never really had believed. Suddenly Dave turned to him, his dark eyes intense. "Look, Tam," he said quickly, urgently. "There are jobs you can get. Go to Mercury for a while, work the mines, not long, just for a while, out there in the sun, then you can come back." Tam's ears burned, fierce anger suddenly bursting in his mind, a feeling of loathing. "Never," he snapped. "I know what you mean. I don't do things that way. That's a coward's way, and by God, I'm no coward." "But it would be so easy, Tam." Dave's eyes were pleading now. "Please." Tam's eyes glinted. "No dice. I've got a better idea. There's one thing I can do. It's not very nice, but at least it's honest and square. I'm hungry. There's one place where I can get food. Even sharkies get food there. And a bed to sleep in, and books to read. Maybe even some sharky books, and maybe some paper to write on." He stared at the big man, oddly, his pale eyes feverish. Yes, there's one place I can go, and get plenty to eat, and get away from this eternal rottenness." Dave looked up at him, his eyes suspicious. "Where do you mean?" "Prison," said Tam Peters. "Oh, now, see here, let's not be ridiculous." "Not so ridiculous," snapped Tam, his eyes brighter. "I figured it all out before I came up here. I knew what you were going to say. Sure, go to Mercury, Tam, work in the mines a while. Well, I can't do it that way. And there's only one other answer." "But Tam—" "Oh, it wouldn't take much. You know how the courts handle sharkies. Just a small offence to get me a few years, then a couple of attempts to break out and I'd be in for life. I'm a sharky, remember? People don't waste time with us." "Tam, you're talking nonsense. Good Lord, man, you'd have no freedom, no life. What freedom do I have now?" Tam snarled, his voice growing wild. "Freedom to starve? Freedom to crawl on my hands and knees for a little bit of food? I don't want that kind of freedom." His eyes grew shrewd, shifted slyly to Dave Hawkes' broad face. "Just a simple charge," he said slowly. "Like assault, for instance. Criminal assault. It has an ugly sound, doesn't it, Dave? That should give me 10 years. His fist clenched at his side. "Yes, criminal assault is just what ought to do the trick." The big man tried to dodge, but Tam was too quick. His fist caught Dave in the chest, and Tam was on him like a fury, kicking, scratching, snarling, pounding. Dave choked and cried out, "Tam, for God's sake, stop!" A blow caught him in the mouth, choking off his words as Tam fought, all the hate and bitterness of long, weary years translated into scratching, swearing desperation. Dave pushed him off like a bear trying to disentangle a maddened dog from his fur, but Tam was back at him, fighting harder. The door opened, and Miss Jackson's frightened face appeared briefly, then vanished. Finally, Dave lifted a heavy fist, drove it hard into Tam's stomach, then sadly lifted the choking, gasping man to the floor. The police came in seconds later, clubs drawn, eyes wide. They dragged Tam out, one on each arm. Dave sank back, his eyes filling, a sickness growing in the pit of his stomach. In court, a sharky would draw the maximum sentence without leniency. 10 years in prison. Dave leaned forward, his face in his hands, tears running down his black cheeks, sobs shaking his broad, heavy shoulders. Why wouldn't he listen? Why couldn't he have gone to Mercury? Only a few months, not long enough to hurt him. Why couldn't he have gone and worked out in the sun, got that hot sun down on his hands and face? Not for long,
Just for a little while. 2 or 3 months and he'd have been dark enough to pass. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the stories, hit the like button. And for much more, I strongly recommend you go over to my Substack. There I'm posting 3 free stories per week, 2 of them sci-fi and another usually fantasy or mythology. Then if you're able to support a little more, paid subscribers get a full novelette-length story every week or a serialized novel, and access to all archived content. Substack is a more sustainable and consistent platform than the attention economy of YouTube. If you sign up, I'll send you all the stories in one helpful email every Saturday. So head over to storiesfromtheskysff.substack.com, link in the description. See you there.